The screaming started before dawn, and Alara knew, even without seeing a single face, that this day would end her old life forever. She sat on the cold dirt floor of her small hut, her fingers wrapped tightly around a wooden bowl, listening to the sound of boots pounding against the road outside. Voices rose and fell in waves of panic. Doors slammed, a child cried somewhere close, and a mother hushed him with a trembling voice that did nothing to hide her own fear. Alara had been blind since the fever took her sight when she was 6 years old. In the 11 years since, she had learned to listen more carefully than most people ever needed to. She could hear a lie in the shake of someone's breath. She could hear fear in the way footsteps quickened. And this morning, she heard something she had never heard before, in the village of Ashwood. She heard surrender. "They have come for the names," said old Agnes, bursting through the low doorway without knocking. Agnes was the healer of the village, a woman with rough hands and a rougher voice, but she had always been kind to Alara, ever since her mother died 3 winters ago. "The king's men are reading the list in the square. Alara, girl, you need to come." "The list for what?" Alara asked, though some cold part of her already understood. "The sacrifice," Agnes whispered, as if saying the word too loudly might summon the curse itself. "It is that time of year again. The elders drew names from every house that could not pay the toll. Yours was one of them." Alara set the bowl down slowly. Her hands did not shake, though her heart pounded so hard she was certain Agnes could hear it too. "Why would they choose me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Her family had no coin. Her father had died before she was born, lost at sea on a merchant ship that never returned. Her mother had scraped together a life of thread and small mending jobs, teaching Alara the shape of cloth with her fingers instead of her eyes, until the fever took her too, leaving Alara alone, in a hut at the edge of Ashwood, with nothing but her wits and her hearing to protect her. The wealthier families in the village had long ago found a way around the yearly sacrifice. A payment here, a gift there, enough silver pressed into the right palms, and their daughters were spared, while the poor were left exposed like unguarded sheep before wolves. Alara had always known this. She had simply never believed her name would be called. "You must come now," Agnes said, gripping her arm. "If you do not appear, they will drag you, and it will be far worse for you." Alara rose on unsteady legs, and let the old woman guide her out into the square. The morning air was sharp and smelled of wood smoke and fear. She could hear the crowd before she reached them, a low murmur of voices, trying to be brave and failing. "Alara, daughter of Miriam," a deep voice announced. It belonged to a soldier, his tone flat and practiced, as though he had read 100 names before hers and would read 100 more after. "You have been chosen as this year's offering to the curse of King Ronan Blackthorn, ruler of the Shadowmere lands. You will be delivered to the castle before the next full moon." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone near Alara whispered a prayer. Another voice, closer, muttered that it was a shame, such a young girl, and blind besides, as if her blindness made the tragedy heavier somehow. Alara said nothing. She stood perfectly still, her chin lifted, refusing to give the crowd the tears they seemed to expect from her. She had learned long ago that showing weakness in front of people who could not help you only made them feel better about doing nothing. "Alara," Agnes whispered beside her, voice cracking. "I am so sorry, child." "It is not your fault," Alara answered quietly. "None of this is anyone's fault but the ones who made the rules." She let herself be led back to her hut, where 2 soldiers stood waiting to make certain she did not try to run. As if a blind girl with nowhere else to go would attempt to flee into the forest and die there instead, alone and forgotten, rather than face whatever waited for her at the castle. That evening, as the soldiers packed what little food they thought she would need for the journey, Agnes came to sit with her one last time. "Tell me about him," Alara asked. "The king. What do they say about him?" Agnes was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that told Alara the old woman was choosing her words carefully. "They say he was cursed as a young man," Agnes finally said. "Long before he became king, when his father still ruled the Shadowmere lands. Some say a witch placed the curse on his bloodline, generations ago, punishment for a broken promise. Others say it began with him alone, some private sin no one speaks of. Either way, when the moon grows full, something inside him changes. He becomes something else, something the people fear." "Does he hurt people?" Alara asked. They say his wolf spirit turns wild under the full moon, and anyone near him during those nights does not survive, Agnes said. The sacrifice began 3 years ago, when the deaths grew too many to hide. The elders believe offering someone to him during the full moon calms the curse, gives it something to focus on besides destruction. I do not know if it is true. I only know that no one who has gone to the castle has ever returned to tell us. Ilara absorbed this information the way she absorbed everything, quietly, turning it over in her mind like a stone she was testing for sharp edges. Are you afraid? Agnes asked her. Ilara considered the question honestly before answering. I have been afraid of many things in my life. Afraid of falling into the river because I could not see it. Afraid of going hungry in winter. Afraid of being alone forever, since I have no one left. This is simply one more fear to carry. I do not think fear will help me now. I think only calm will help me. Agnes squeezed her hand, and neither of them spoke again, until the soldiers came to say it was time to sleep, before the long journey ahead. The next morning, Ilara was placed inside a covered cart, her wrists bound loosely, more for appearance than true restraint. She did not think a blind girl posed much threat of escape, and neither, apparently, did the soldiers guarding her. The cart rattled along uneven roads for hours, carrying her farther from everything she had ever known. She listened to the world change around her as they traveled. The familiar sounds of ashwood, chickens clucking, the creak of the old mill wheel, children playing near the well, slowly faded behind her. In their place came new sounds, the rush of a wider river, the calls of birds she did not recognize, the distant, echoing bark of dogs that sounded larger and more dangerous than any she had heard before. By the second day, the air itself felt different, colder, somehow, despite the season. Ilara noticed the soldiers grew quieter as the journey continued, their casual conversation from the first day disappearing into tense silence. She heard one of them mutter something about being glad they would not have to enter the castle grounds themselves, that dropping off the offering at the gate was job enough for any sane man. Is the castle truly so terrible? Ilara asked, unable to stop herself. The soldier nearest her, a younger man whose voice still held traces of nervous kindness, answered carefully. It is not the castle that frightens men, girl. It is what happens inside it, once the moon rises. He said nothing more after that, and Ilara did not ask again. On the third day, the cart came to a stop, and Ilara heard something that made her breath catch, despite her efforts to remain calm. A massive gate groaning open on ancient hinges. The sound of it seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath the cart wheels. We have arrived, the younger soldier said, his voice tight. This is as far as we go. Rough hands helped her down from the cart, though not unkindly. She felt gravel beneath her worn shoes, and a cold wind that carried a strange, wild scent she could not place. Something like pine and smoke, and something underneath that made the hair on her arms rise without her understanding why. Someone will come for you, the soldier said. We are not permitted past the outer gate. She heard the cart turning, the soldiers eager to be gone before darkness fell. Within moments, she was alone, standing at the edge of a place she could not see, waiting for whatever fate had been decided for her, by people who would never have to face it themselves. Ilara stood there for what felt like a very long time, listening to the wind move through unfamiliar trees, feeling the enormous, silent presence of the castle looming somewhere ahead of her, unseen, but undeniably felt, like a held breath before a scream. She thought of her mother, of the gentle hands that had once guided her own fingers over the shapes of letters and stitches, teaching her that a person could learn to see the world in more ways than one. She thought of Agnes, and the quiet kindness that had been the last warmth she would carry into this cold, uncertain place. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate, echoing off unseen stone walls. Ilara straightened her spine and lifted her chin, refusing to let whoever approached hear fear in her breathing, even if her heart continued to pound like a drum inside her chest. You are the one they have sent, a voice said. It was not the king's voice, she realized, too formal, too careful, the voice of a servant or guard rather than a ruler. Come, the king wishes to see you before the moon rises. Ilara reached out instinctively, and a firm but gentle hand took her arm, guiding her forward across ground that shifted from gravel to smooth stone beneath her feet. The air grew warmer as they moved, though the strange, wild scent from before grew stronger too, filling her senses with something ancient and untamed. She was led through what felt like a long corridor, her footsteps echoing strangely against walls she imagined must be impossibly high. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the low, mournful howl of a wolf, and she felt her guide's hand tighten slightly around her arm. "That is not an animal in the forest, is it?" Ilara said quietly, more statement than question. The guard did not answer her, and his silence told her everything she needed to know. They stopped before what she guessed was a heavy door, based on the deep groan it made as it swung open. The guard released her arm. "Wait here," he said. "He will come for you soon." His footsteps retreated quickly, as though he could not leave fast enough, and the door closed behind him with a heavy, final sound. Ilara stood alone in the silence of the chamber, listening to her own breathing, waiting for the king who supposedly could not control the beast within him, wondering if this would be the last quiet moment of her life, and finding, to her own surprise, that beneath her fear lay something else entirely. A strange, stubborn curiosity about the man, or the creature, she was about to meet. She did not know yet that the king who was coming for her had never once, in all his years of ruling, met anyone who was not afraid of what he had become. The chamber around her felt vast, though she could only guess at its size from the way sound traveled within it. Her footsteps, when she took a few cautious steps forward, echoed faintly, before fading into what she imagined must be a high, distant ceiling. The air here was cooler than the corridor outside, carrying a faint trace of old stone and something sweeter beneath it, like dried herbs left too long in a jar. She reached out with both hands, until her fingers brushed against the edge of a heavy table. She traced its surface carefully, feeling the grain of old wood, worn smooth in places by years of use. Beside it stood a chair, and beyond that, she thought she could feel the faint warmth of a hearth, though no fire crackled within it now. Ilara settled herself onto the edge of the chair, resisting the urge to fidget with the rope still loosely wound around her wrists. She thought of the stories Agnes had told her, of a king who could not control the beast inside him, of villagers who whispered his name only when necessary, and never without fear following close behind it. She wondered how much of what people said was truth, and how much was simply what fear allowed people to believe, when the truth itself was too uncertain to face directly. Growing up blind had taught her one lesson above all others. People were often wrong about what they could not see clearly, and right about very little that they merely assumed. She had spent her whole life being underestimated by people who judged her only by what she lacked, never bothering to notice what she had gained in its place. Perhaps, she thought, the king suffered a similar fate. Perhaps the entire kingdom had decided what he was before ever giving him the chance to be anything else. It was a strange thought to hold on to while waiting to meet a man who might very well end her life within days, but it steadied her all the same. Fear, she reminded herself again, would not serve her here. Only patience and calm might carry her through whatever came next. Somewhere beyond the heavy door, she heard the faint sound of voices, low and hurried, servants perhaps, exchanging words too quiet for her to catch clearly. She caught fragments, only fragments, words like moon and chamber and be ready, spoken in tones that suggested urgency without panic, the practiced urgency of people long accustomed to preparing for something dangerous. Then, quite suddenly, the voices stopped. A silence fell over the corridor outside, heavier than before, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath. Ilara sat very still, straining her ears for any sound at all, and found none. Even the wind, which she had heard whistling faintly through some distant window earlier, seemed to have gone quiet. And then she heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from somewhere deep within the castle. They were heavier than the guard's footsteps had been, more measured, carrying a weight that seemed to press into the very stone beneath them. Ilara's heart began to pound harder with every step that drew closer, though she forced her hands to remain still in her lap, forced her breathing to remain even. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Ilara imagined, though she could not know for certain, that whoever stood on the other side of that door was studying it, perhaps hesitating, perhaps simply gathering himself before entering. She wondered if he always paused like this before facing whoever waited within, or if something about tonight felt different to him as well. The door opened with a low groan, and a rush of cooler air swept into the chamber, carrying with it that same wild, untamed scent she had noticed earlier, stronger now, almost overwhelming. She heard him step inside, heard the door close again behind him with quiet finality, sealing them both within the chamber together. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Elara sat perfectly still, waiting, listening, refusing to let herself flinch away from whatever came next. And somewhere in the darkness she could not see, King Ronan Blackthorn stood studying the girl who had been sent to him as an offering, waiting for the fear he had come to expect from everyone who ever stood before him. It did not come, and in the silence that followed, something shifted between them that neither one of them yet understood. King Ronan Blackthorn stood in the doorway of the chamber, staring at the girl who did not tremble. He had expected the usual reaction. He always did. In the 3 years since the sacrifice ritual began, every single person who had stood before him in this chamber had reacted the same way, whether they tried to hide it or not. Their breathing would quicken. Their bodies would go rigid with the effort of holding still. Some cried openly, others begged. A few had even fainted before he spoke a single word to them. This girl did none of that. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her chin tilted slightly upward, her unseeing eyes fixed somewhere near the center of the room rather than directly at him, though he sensed she was listening to him with an intensity that unsettled him more than any scream could have. "You are not looking at me," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, years of solitude having stripped away whatever gentleness it might once have carried. "I cannot look at anyone," she answered simply. "I have been blind since I was a child." Ronan felt something twist inside his chest, an unfamiliar sensation he could not immediately name. Guilt, perhaps, though guilt had never stopped the sacrifices before, and he doubted it would start now with one blind girl. "They sent me a girl who cannot see the very thing she is meant to fear," he said, more to himself than to her. "Perhaps that is why they chose me," Elara replied. "A blind girl is easy to give away. No one worries she will see too much, or tell tales after, because everyone assumes there is nothing left for her to see or tell." Her words carried no bitterness, only a plain, matter-of-fact honesty that struck him harder than any accusation might have. He moved further into the chamber, his footsteps deliberately slow, watching her closely as he did, waiting for the moment her calm would finally break. It did not break. "Do you know why you have been brought here?" he asked. "I have been told stories," she said. "That you carry a curse. That when the moon grows full, something changes in you. Something dangerous. That offering someone to you during those nights keeps the danger contained, so it does not spread beyond these walls. And are you afraid of what happens to that someone?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Elara considered the question with the same careful patience she seemed to bring to everything. "I have decided that fear will not help me survive whatever is coming, so I choose, instead, to be curious, to listen, to understand, if I can, rather than simply to be afraid." Ronan stared at her for a long moment, unable to fully grasp what he was hearing. In all his years as king, cursed and feared in equal measure, no one had ever spoken to him this way. Not his advisors, who addressed him with careful formality, designed to avoid provoking his temper. Not his people, who avoided his gaze entirely whenever he passed through the villages under his protection. Certainly not the previous offerings, who had wept and pleaded and, in the end, met fates he still could not bring himself to think about clearly, even after all this time. "You should be afraid," he said finally, though the words came out less forceful than he intended. "Perhaps," Elara agreed, "but being afraid has never solved anything for me before. I do not see why it would begin now." He found himself, against every instinct built over years of isolation, almost smiling at her response, though the expression felt foreign and stiff on his face, like a muscle unused for far too long. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elara," she said. "And yours, my lord?" "I have only been told you are the king, but a name feels more honest than a title, if you are willing to share it." "Ronan," he answered, surprising himself with how easily the name left his lips. He had not introduced himself by his given name to anyone outside his closest circle in years. "Ronan," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "That is a good name." He did not know how to respond to something so simple, so unguarded. He was used to flattery from courtiers who wanted favor, and fear from villagers who wanted only distance. Genuine, uncomplicated conversation was a foreign language he had nearly forgotten how to speak. "You should know," he said, forcing his voice back into something firmer, more befitting a king addressing a prisoner, That the moon rises in 3 nights. Whatever happens then, I cannot promise your safety." "I understand," Elara said, and for the first time, he heard the faintest tremor beneath her calm, quickly suppressed, but not entirely hidden from his sharpened senses. "May I ask you something, Ronan?" He nodded, before remembering she could not see the gesture. "Yes," he said aloud. "Have you ever tried to stop it?" she asked. "The curse. Has anyone ever tried to find another way, besides sending people to you like offerings at an altar?" The question landed like a blow he had not braced for. No one asked him this. No one dared to suggest that perhaps the sacrifices were not the only answer, that perhaps there existed some other path he had simply never been given the chance, or the courage, to pursue. "Many have tried," he said quietly. "Healers, witches. My own father, before he died, spent years searching for a cure, or at least a way to lessen what happens to me. Nothing worked. The curse is old, older than my family's rule over these lands, and it does not yield easily to remedies." "But has anyone tried simply talking to it?" Elara asked. "To you, I mean, rather than to the curse, as though it were separate from you entirely?" Ronan frowned, though he knew she could not see his expression. "The wolf inside me is not something that listens to reason, Elara. When the moon rises, whatever remains of the man disappears, and only the beast remains. There is no talking to it, there is only survival, for whoever happens to be near me." "How do you know that for certain?" she asked. "If no one has ever truly tried." He had no answer for her. In truth, he did not know, not with the certainty he pretended to carry. He had simply accepted, long ago, that the beast within him was beyond reasoning, beyond reaching, because believing otherwise meant hoping for something he had long since convinced himself was impossible. "You ask a great many questions for someone who has been sent here as an offering," he said, deflecting rather than answering. "I have very little else to occupy my mind," Elara replied, a faint hint of dry humor slipping into her voice for the first time. "And questions have always been my way of understanding the world, since my eyes cannot do that work for me." Something about her honesty, her strange blend of vulnerability and quiet strength, made Ronan want to continue this conversation far longer than he knew he should. He was the king. She was meant to be an offering, nothing more. A sacrifice, to appease a curse he had long since stopped believing could ever truly be tamed. And yet here he stood, speaking with her as though she were simply a guest, as though the horror awaiting them both in 3 nights' time did not loom over every word they exchanged. "You should rest," he said finally, forcing the conversation to its close, before he allowed himself to forget the reality of their situation entirely. "A room has been prepared for you. It is not a cell, though I imagine it will feel like one regardless."
"Thank you,"
Elara said, rising carefully from her chair, her hand searching briefly for something to steady herself, before finding the edge of the table. Ronan moved to guide her, his hand hovering near her elbow before he stopped himself, uncertain whether such closeness was appropriate, uncertain of many things that had once felt simple to him before this strange girl arrived, and unsettled every assumption he carried about how these encounters were meant to unfold. "May I?" he asked, surprising himself again with the question. "Yes," Elara said, and he felt her hand settle lightly against his offered arm, trusting him with an ease that struck him as almost reckless, given everything she had been told about what he was capable of becoming. He led her from the chamber and down a long corridor, matching his pace carefully to hers, more careful, more deliberate than he had been with anyone in longer than he could remember. Servants they passed along the way stared openly, whispering behind hands raised too late to hide their surprise. Their king, who avoided contact with others whenever possible, who kept himself isolated within the castle walls except when duty demanded otherwise, walked now with quiet care beside the newest offering, guiding her steps as though she were something precious rather than something to be discarded. Ronan noticed the stairs. He chose, for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, to ignore them entirely. When they reached the room prepared for her, he opened the door and guided her inside, describing briefly the layout of the space, the position of the bed, the small table near the window, details he suspected she would memorize quickly through touch and repetition, the way she seemed to memorize everything else about her surroundings. 3 nights, she said quietly, as he prepared to leave her there alone. 3 nights, he confirmed. Ronan, she said, just as he reached the door. Whatever happens when the moon rises, I do not think you are only a monster. I think there may be more to you than the curse has allowed anyone to see." He stood frozen for a long moment, his hand resting against the cold wood of the doorframe, unable to find any words adequate to answer her. No one had ever said such a thing to him before, not since his father died, not since the crown and the curse had become inseparable in the eyes of everyone who knew him. "You should not trust so easily," he finally said, his voice rougher than before. "Not with someone like me." "Perhaps," Alara answered softly, "but I have found that trust given carefully is rarely wasted entirely, even when it is met with disappointment. And something tells me, Ronan, that you may surprise both of us before these 3 nights are through." He left the room without responding, closing the door quietly behind him, and stood alone in the corridor for a long while afterward, listening to the sound of his own uneven breathing, wondering, for the first time in years, whether the curse he carried was truly as absolute and unreachable as he had always believed it to be. He made his way toward his own chambers through corridors that felt colder than usual tonight, though he suspected the chill had less to do with the stone walls around him, and more to do with the strange unease still lingering in his chest. A servant hurried past him, a young man named Cormac who had served the household since childhood, and offered a hesitant bow before continuing on his way without meeting the king's eyes, as always. Ronan paused at the window overlooking the courtyard below, watching the last light of evening fade behind the distant tree line. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the village of Ashwood, and beyond that, countless other villages under his protection, all of them living in quiet dread of the nights when the moon grew full, and their king became something they no longer recognized as a man. He thought of his father, King Aldrich, who had ruled these lands before him, and carried the same curse in his final years, though the affliction had come to him later in life, and with less ferocity than it now showed in Ronan. His father had spent his last years searching desperately for any remedy, consulting healers from distant kingdoms, sending emissaries to seek out old witches rumored to hold knowledge of ancient curses. None of it had worked. His father had died believing the curse would simply have to be endured, generation after generation, until some unknown day when fate finally decided otherwise. Ronan had inherited that same belief, along with the crown and the curse itself. He had long ago stopped searching for answers, resigning himself instead to managing the consequences as best he could, protecting his people by containing the damage, rather than hoping for a cure that seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing year. And yet Alara's question lingered in his mind, refusing to be dismissed as easily as he wished it could be. Has anyone tried simply talking to it? The question was foolish, he told himself. Naive, even, coming from a girl who had never witnessed the transformation firsthand, who could not understand the sheer violence of what happened to him when the moon claimed control of his body and mind. But some small, stubborn part of him could not stop wondering whether she might be onto something no one else had considered, simply because everyone else who ever stood before him had been too consumed by fear to ask anything beyond how quickly they might escape his presence. He made his way to his private study, a room lined with old books and dusty scrolls collected by generations of Blackthorn rulers before him, many of them dealing with the history of the curse itself. He had read through most of these texts years ago, searching for anything useful, before eventually giving up the search entirely. Tonight, for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself pulling several of the oldest volumes from their shelves once more, blowing dust from their covers, settling into his chair to read them again with fresh eyes. The hours passed slowly as he searched through pages he had long since memorized, looking now not for a cure, exactly, but for any mention of what the curse actually was, at its core. Most texts described it simply as an affliction, a punishment, a burden passed down through blood. Few offered any detail about the nature of the beast itself, whether it was truly separate from the man who carried it, or whether, as Alara had suggested, it might simply be an extension of him, wild and untamed, but not entirely beyond reach. One passage, tucked within an older text he had nearly overlooked in his earlier searches, caught his attention. It spoke of curses tied to broken promises, suggesting that some such afflictions might be lessened, though never fully removed, through acts of genuine connection rather than force or containment. The passage was vague, frustratingly so, offering no clear instructions, only a suggestion that the nature of a curse often mirrored the nature of the wound that created it. Ronan closed the book slowly, staring at nothing in particular, his mind turning over possibilities he had refused to consider for years. Could it be true that his curse responded not to fear or containment, but to something else entirely, something he had never once tried, because he had never once believed anyone could offer it to him without flinching first? He thought again of Alara, sitting calmly in that chamber, unafraid, despite everything she had been told, asking questions no one else had dared to ask him in years. Perhaps she was simply naive, as he had first assumed. Or perhaps, and this thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit, perhaps she was the first person in a very long time to see him as something other than a monster waiting to be contained. 3 nights remained before the moon would test whatever fragile possibility had begun to form between them tonight. Ronan closed his study door quietly behind him and made his way toward his own chambers, uncertain, for the first time in years, whether he was dreading the full moon's arrival, or, against every instinct he had built to protect himself from disappointment, beginning to hope for something different this time. The second day in the castle began with the sound of a tray being set carefully on the table beside her bed, and a young woman's voice introducing herself as Nessa, one of the servants assigned to attend to Alara during her stay. "I have brought bread and warm milk," Nessa said, her voice carrying a nervous energy Alara had come to recognize from nearly everyone within these walls. "The king instructed me to see that you are comfortable." "That is kind of him," Alara said, sitting up carefully and reaching for the edge of the tray, her fingers finding the warm bowl of milk before the small loaf of bread beside it. Nessa lingered near the door, clearly hesitant to leave, though equally uncertain about staying. "May I ask you something?" she finally said, her voice dropping lower, as though fearing someone might overhear. "Of course," Alara replied. "Were you very frightened, meeting him last night?" Alara considered the question carefully before answering. "I was frightened before I met him," she said. "But once he was actually there, speaking with me, the fear became something smaller, easier to manage." "He spoke with you," Nessa repeated, something like disbelief coloring her tone. "The king does not usually speak much with anyone, especially not with the ones sent here for the sacrifice. Usually he simply confirms their arrival and leaves them to wait alone until the moon rises." This piece of information settled into Alara's mind carefully, another small stone added to the growing collection of details she was gathering about the man she had met the previous evening. "What is he like, when you see him during ordinary days?" she asked. "Before the moon changes him?" Nessa was quiet for a moment, as though weighing how much she was permitted to share. "He is quiet," she finally said, distant, mostly. "He keeps to himself in his study, or walking the castle grounds alone at night, when he thinks no one is watching. The servants who have worked here longest say he was different once, before the curse worsened. Kinder, more open with people. But that was many years ago, before I came to serve here." "What changed him?" Alara asked. "I do not know for certain," Nessa admitted. "Some say it was his father's death that hardened him. Others say the curse itself grows worse with time, twisting the person as much as the body. I only know the king I have served these past 2 years is not a man who invites conversation, and yet you say he spoke with you at length last night." Alara smiled faintly at this, though she said nothing further on the matter, unwilling to share more of the conversation than necessary with someone she had only just met, however kind Nessa's intentions seemed to be. After Nessa left, promising to return later with more food, Alara spent the remainder of the morning exploring her chamber carefully, memorizing the position of furniture, counting steps between the bed and the window and the door, building a mental map of the space that would allow her to move confidently, even in the darkness that was, for her, simply the ordinary state of the world. She was in the midst of this careful exploration when she heard footsteps approaching her door, heavier and more measured than Nessa's had been. Her heart quickened, recognizing the rhythm from the previous evening. "Alara," Ronan's voice called from beyond the door. "May I come in?" "Yes," she said, straightening automatically, smoothing her simple dress with hands that betrayed a flicker of nervousness she quickly suppressed. He entered the room, and she noted immediately that his footsteps carried something different today. Less guarded, perhaps, though still careful. "I trust you slept well," he said. "Well enough," Alara answered honestly, though sleep does not come easily in unfamiliar places, even for someone accustomed to darkness. "I imagine not," he said, and she heard him settle into a chair near the window, the wood creaking softly under his weight. "I came to ask you something," if you will permit it. Of course, she said, moving to sit on the edge of her bed, facing the direction of his voice. Last night, you asked whether anyone had ever tried simply talking to the wolf inside me, rather than treating it as something entirely separate, beyond reason or reach, he said. I have thought about that question a great deal since we spoke. And what have you concluded? Elara asked, genuinely curious. I do not know, he admitted, and something in his voice carried a vulnerability she had not expected from a man everyone described as cold and distant. I spent much of the night reading old texts about the curse, searching for anything that might support what you suggested. I found little of certainty, but I found enough to wonder whether I have simply accepted defeat too easily, all these years, rather than truly searching for another path. Elara felt a small spark of something like hope kindle within her chest, though she was careful not to let it grow too quickly, mindful of how easily hope could become disappointment in situations as uncertain as this one. What would it mean to try talking to it? She asked. What would that even look like? I do not know that either, Ronan admitted. No one has ever attempted such a thing with me. Not truly. My father tried remedies, potions, rituals performed by healers and witches alike, but none of them involved simply remaining present with me during the transformation itself, speaking to whatever remains of the man beneath the beast. Because it has always been considered too dangerous, Elara said, understanding now the shape of the problem before her. Yes, Ronan confirmed. Everyone who has ever been near me during the full moon has either died or fled before the worst of it could reach them. There has never been anyone willing, or perhaps foolish enough, to remain calm in my presence, long enough to test whether words might reach through whatever consumes me. Elara considered this carefully, understanding fully now what he was suggesting, even before he spoke the words aloud. You wish to know whether I might be willing to try, she said. I would never ask such a thing of you, Ronan said quickly, his voice firm. The risk is far too great, and I have no right to place that burden on someone who has already been forced into this situation against her will. But you are considering it, Elara pressed gently, whether I offer or not. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. Yes, he admitted. I am considering many things I have not allowed myself to consider in years, since you arrived. Elara sat with this admission, weighing the fear that still lived somewhere within her against the strange, persistent curiosity that had taken root the moment she first heard his voice, gruff, yet careful, in that chamber the previous night. She thought of her mother, of Agnes, of the quiet life she had lived in Ashwood, always underestimated, always overlooked, until the day the curse of another person's fate had swept her into circumstances far beyond anything she could have imagined. I will not pretend I am not afraid, she finally said, but I have already told you. Fear alone has never solved anything for me. If there is even a small chance that remaining calm, that speaking with you honestly, might help rather than harm, I am willing to consider it, Ronan. Though I would ask that we take these next 2 days to prepare as carefully as we can, rather than simply hoping for the best when the moon finally rises. Relief and something else, something warmer, flickered across Ronan's features, though Elara could not see it, only sensed the shift in his breathing, the way his voice softened further when he spoke again. Thank you, he said quietly. I did not expect such generosity from someone I have wronged, simply by allowing this system of sacrifice to continue for as long as it has. You did not create the curse, Elara said gently. And from what you have told me, you have spent years searching for ways to contain the damage it causes, even if you had given up searching for a true cure. That is not nothing, Ronan, even if it has not felt like enough. They spent the remainder of that afternoon in careful conversation, Ronan describing what little he understood about the physical sensations that preceded his transformation each month, the tightening in his chest, the strange pull behind his eyes, the moment when his thoughts began to blur at the edges, before disappearing entirely into something wilder and less controlled. Elara listened carefully, asking questions, searching for patterns, for anything that might suggest a foothold where reason could grip and hold against the tide of the curse. By evening, when Ronan finally rose to leave, promising to return again the following day, something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. A fragile thread of trust woven carefully across the space of dangerous unknowns, still waiting for them both, when the full moon finally rose. After he left, Nessa returned with a simple supper of stew and fresh bread, and Elara ate slowly, turning over the events of the day in her mind. She thought of how differently things had unfolded from what she had expected when the soldiers first delivered her to the castle gate. She had imagined isolation, perhaps cruelty, certainly fear. Instead, she had found a man who seemed as trapped by his circumstances as she was by her own. Someone who had spent years accepting a fate he had never truly tested, simply because no one had given him reason to believe another path existed. "You seem thoughtful tonight," Nessa observed, gathering the empty bowl once Alara had finished eating. "I am thinking about how strange it is," Alara said, "that a person can be feared for so long, by so many, that they forget to ask whether the fear itself is entirely deserved, or whether it has simply become a habit no one thinks to question." Nessa was quiet for a moment. "You speak of the king," she said, not quite a question. "I do," Alara admitted. "Be careful," Nessa said gently, though not unkindly. "I do not say this to frighten you further, but because I care what happens to you, even though we have only just met. The curse is real, Alara. Whatever kindness you may have found in him during ordinary daylight hours, the moon changes something in him that even he cannot control. I have heard the sounds from the castle towers on those nights, even from my quarters far below. They are not sounds a person forgets easily." "I understand your concern," Alara said, "and I do not intend to be reckless, but I also do not intend to simply accept that nothing can be done, when neither of us yet knows for certain whether that is true." Nessa sighed, though she said nothing further, simply squeezing Alara's hand gently, before leaving her alone for the evening. Alara sat by her window for a long while after Nessa's departure, feeling the cool evening air drift through the small gap left open for fresh breeze, listening to the distant sounds of the castle settling into night. Somewhere beyond these walls, she knew, the moon was growing fuller each night, drawing closer to the fullness that would test everything she had decided to risk in these past 2 days. She thought of her mother again, of the quiet strength the older woman had shown even in her final illness, never once complaining, never once asking for pity, simply facing each day with the same steady patience she had taught her daughter to carry as well. Alara had always believed that patience and calm were her greatest gifts, the tools that had allowed her to navigate a world built for those who could see, without ever losing herself to bitterness or despair. Now, for the first time, she wondered whether those same gifts might be enough to reach through a curse that had defeated healers, witches, and kings alike. The following 2 days passed in a similar rhythm, Ronan visiting each morning and afternoon, the two of them speaking at length about the curse, about his childhood, about the isolation that had settled over him since his father's death, and the weight of ruling a kingdom that both depended on him and feared him in equal measure. She learned that his mother had died giving birth to him, a fact he shared quietly, almost apologetically, as though confessing some personal failing rather than a simple tragedy of circumstance. She learned that his father, King Aldrich, had raised him largely alone, teaching him the burdens of leadership before he was old enough to fully understand them, all while battling his own encroaching symptoms of the very curse Ronan now carried in full force. "Did your father ever find peace with it?" Alara asked him on the second afternoon, as they sat together in the castle gardens, a rare excursion Ronan had suggested, guiding her carefully along paths lined with fragrant herbs and late-blooming flowers. "I do not believe so," Ronan admitted. He grew quieter as the years went on, more withdrawn. "I think he spent his final years simply enduring, rather than living. I have often wondered whether that fate awaits me as well, whether this is simply what becomes of anyone who carries this particular burden long enough." "It does not have to be your fate," Alara said firmly. "Your father may not have had anyone willing to try what we are attempting now. That does not mean the outcome must be the same for you." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, and Alara could hear the soft rustle of leaves overhead, the distant call of some bird she did not recognize, the quiet hum of insects moving through the garden around them. "You give me more hope than I have felt in years," he finally said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not fully name. "I do not know if I deserve it, but I am grateful for it all the same." "You do not need to deserve hope for it to be worth holding on to," Alara said gently. "Sometimes it is simply enough to need it." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the weight of the approaching full moon settling over them both, but somehow lighter now than it had felt before, carried together rather than alone. On the third morning, Ronan came to Alara's chamber earlier than usual, his voice carrying a tension she had not heard from him before. "The moon rises tonight," he said, without preamble. I wanted to speak with you once more before evening comes, to be certain you still wish to proceed with this, and to be certain you understand fully what may happen if I am wrong about all of this. Alara set aside the piece of bread she had been eating, and turned toward the sound of his voice. Tell me again what you expect to happen, she said. I want to understand as clearly as I can, so that I am not caught by surprise when it begins. Ronan was quiet for a moment, and she could hear him moving closer, settling into the chair near her window, as he had done each day before this one. The transformation begins slowly, he said, a tightening in my chest, first, as though something inside me is drawing tight, like a rope pulled taut, then a pressure behind my eyes, and my thoughts begin to blur, become harder to hold on to. By the time the moon is fully risen, I am told my eyes change color, and my strength increases beyond anything natural. What happens after that, I genuinely do not remember clearly. I am told there is violence, destruction. I have never been able to recall the details myself, only the aftermath. And you believe that during this time, you are entirely gone, Alara said, that nothing of you remains present. That has always been the assumption, Ronan said, though I confess, after our conversations these past 2 days, I am less certain of that assumption than I once was. Then let us test it, Alara said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. Tonight, when the transformation begins, I will remain nearby, and I will speak to you, calmly, steadily, the way we have spoken to each other these past days. If any part of you remains capable of hearing me, perhaps it will be enough to anchor you, even briefly. And if it is not enough, Ronan said, his voice heavy with a fear she had never heard from him before, if the beast takes hold completely, and you are still there when it does, I could kill you, Alara. I need you to understand that possibility clearly, before you agree to this. I understand it, Alara said quietly. I have understood it, since I first heard the stories in my village, long before I ever met you. I am not agreeing to this, because I believe there is no risk. I am agreeing because I believe the risk is worth taking, for both our sakes, and perhaps for the sake of anyone else who might otherwise be sent here in years to come, facing this same fate, without ever having the chance to try something different. Ronan was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something rough and unsteady. I do not know how I have come to trust you so completely in such a short time, he said. But I find that I do, more than I have trusted anyone since my father died. Perhaps trust does not always require a great deal of time, Alara said gently. Sometimes it simply requires honesty, offered plainly, without the pretense so many people hide behind. They spent the remainder of the morning discussing practical matters, how the chamber where the transformation would take place should be arranged, where Alara should position herself to remain close enough to speak with him, but with some measure of protection should the worst occur. What signals or words might be tried first, based on everything they had discussed these past days about the sensations preceding his change. Ronan insisted on having heavy chains prepared, anchored into the stone walls of the chamber, a precaution he had used in previous years, though he admitted they had done little to contain the full force of his transformed strength on the worst nights. They may not hold, he warned Alara, but they are the only safeguard I have to offer you, beyond my own uncertain hope that your presence might change something tonight. I accept that risk, Alara said simply. As the day wore on, Alara found herself unable to fully calm the nervous energy building within her chest, despite her outward composure. She thought of Agnes, of her mother, of the quiet life she had once lived in Ashwood, before the sacrifice claimed her future so abruptly. She wondered whether she would live to see another sunrise, and found, to her own surprise, that the thought did not paralyze her the way she might have expected. Instead, it clarified something within her, a sense of purpose she had not felt in years, not since her mother's death had left her adrift in a life that often felt like simple survival, rather than anything more meaningful. In the late afternoon, Nessa came to help Alara prepare, bringing a simple meal and helping her dress in clothing more suited to the physical demands of the evening ahead, practical fabric that would not restrict movement should she need to move quickly. I still think this is reckless, Nessa said, her voice tight with worry as she helped fasten the ties of Alara's dress. But I understand why you are doing it. I only wish there was more I could do to help protect you. You have helped already, simply by caring, Alara said. That matters more than you may realize. As evening approached, Ronan came for her himself, guiding her carefully through the corridors toward the chamber that had been prepared, his hand steady beneath her arm, though she could feel the tension building in his grip with each step closer to their destination. "The moon will rise within the hour," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Once we reach the chamber, I want you to remain near the door, close enough that I might hear you, but far enough that you retain some chance of escape should things go as badly as they have in years past." "I understand," Alara said, though privately she had already decided she would remain as close as necessary to reach him, regardless of the risk involved. She had not come this far, invested this much trust and hope in the possibility of change, only to retreat at the final moment, out of fear for her own safety. They reached the chamber, a large room with high stone walls and heavy chains anchored into the far side, exactly as Ronan had described earlier. A single window, set high above, allowed the fading evening light to filter through, casting long shadows across the floor that Alara could sense through the subtle shifts in temperature and air movement, even without seeing them directly. "This is where it happens," Ronan said quietly, guiding her to a position near the door, though not entirely removed from the center of the room. "I will chain myself once the transformation begins to take hold. Until then, we simply wait." They stood together in tense silence as the evening light slowly faded, the room growing cooler and darker with each passing minute. Alara could feel Ronan's presence beside her, tense and rigid, his breathing growing more uneven as the moment approached. "Alara," he said suddenly, his voice strained, "whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that these past 3 days have given me something I thought I had lost forever: hope. Even if tonight proves that nothing has truly changed, I am grateful to you for reminding me that hope was still possible." "Do not speak as though this is already decided," Alara said firmly, though her own heart pounded with matching intensity. "We do not yet know what tonight will bring. Save your gratitude for after, when we have proof of what has changed, rather than simply believing the worst before we have even begun." Ronan let out a shaky breath, something that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. "You are remarkably stubborn," he said, "for someone who claims to simply be curious rather than brave." "Perhaps stubbornness and curiosity are not so different from each other," Alara replied, when both refuse to accept an answer before truly testing whether it is correct. The last light faded from the high window above, and Alara felt the air in the chamber shift, growing colder, heavier, charged with something she could not name but felt instinctively. A change approaching that neither of them could stop now, only face together, whatever the outcome might be. "It is beginning," Ronan said, his voice already tightening with strain. "Alara, please, step back now, while you still can." Alara did not step back. Instead, she reached out, her hand finding his arm in the darkness, steady and sure, despite the fear coursing through her own body. "I am staying," she said quietly. "Whatever comes next, Ronan, I am staying right here beside you." She felt him shudder beneath her hand, a violent tremor running through his entire frame, and she heard the sharp intake of his breath, ragged and pained. "Alara," he gasped. "I can feel it beginning already, stronger than before. You must move back, now, while there is still time." "Tell me what you feel," Alara said instead, refusing to release his arm, keeping her voice as calm and steady as she could manage, despite the pounding of her own heart. "Describe it to me, the way you did before. Do not let the silence take over your mind. Speak to me instead." Ronan's breathing grew more labored, each exhale sounding as though it cost him tremendous effort. "The tightening," he managed, his voice already deepening, roughening at the edges. "It is spreading through my chest, into my arms. My vision is beginning to blur at the corners, exactly as I described." "Good," Alara said, though nothing about the word felt adequate to the moment. "Keep speaking. Keep your thoughts moving forward, following the sound of my voice." She heard the heavy clink of chains as he moved toward the far wall, his steps growing unsteady, and she followed the sound carefully, keeping enough distance to remain safe, while staying close enough that her voice would still reach him clearly. "I do not know how much longer I can hold my thoughts together," Ronan admitted, his words beginning to slur slightly, as though his tongue no longer moved with its usual precision. "Alara, if I lose myself entirely, if the beast takes hold, and I no longer recognize your voice for what it is, you must run. Promise me you will run." "I will not make that promise." Alara said firmly. Not yet. Keep speaking to me, Ronan. Tell me something else. Tell me about your mother, the one you never knew. What have you imagined about her, over the years? It was a strange question to ask in such a moment, but she had learned, over these past days, that Ronan often found unexpected calm in memories, in the simple act of speaking about things that mattered to him, beyond the immediate crisis of his curse. She hoped, desperately, that the same might hold true even now, as the transformation continued its relentless progress through his body. I have imagined, Ronan said, his voice catching, strained with effort, that she was kind, gentle. My father rarely spoke of her, but once, when I was very young, he told me she had a laugh that filled entire rooms with warmth. I have held on to that image for years, though I do not know if it is even accurate. It is a beautiful image regardless, Alara said softly, moving closer, despite every instinct screaming at her to retreat. She heard the sound of chains being pulled taut, Ronan securing himself against the wall as he had promised, his movements growing increasingly erratic, less controlled. Alara, he said again, and this time his voice had changed entirely, deeper, rougher, carrying an edge that sent a fresh wave of fear through her body, despite her determination to remain calm. Something is happening. I can feel myself slipping away, further than before. Please, you must leave now, while you still have the chance. Not yet, Alara insisted, though her voice trembled now, betraying the fear she had worked so hard to suppress. Ronan, listen to my voice. Hold on to it, however you can. You are not gone yet. I can still hear you in there, beneath whatever is trying to take over. A sound erupted from him then, low and guttural, entirely unlike anything she had heard from him before, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very stone walls around them. Alara froze, every instinct urging her toward the door, toward safety, toward the escape route Ronan himself had begged her to take. She did not move. Ronan, she called again, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. I am still here. Can you hear me? The only response was another low, animalistic growl, followed by the sharp, violent sound of chains straining against stone, and Alara realized, with a cold jolt of fear, that whatever remained of the man she had come to know these past 3 days was rapidly disappearing beneath something far more dangerous, something that might not recognize her voice, or her presence, as anything other than a threat to be destroyed. The chains groaned against the stone wall, straining under a force that seemed impossible for any ordinary man to produce, and Alara stood frozen for a heartbeat, every instinct in her body screaming at her to flee toward the door while she still could. She did not run. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her. Ronan, she called again, louder this time, though careful to keep any hint of panic from her tone. I know you can still hear me, somewhere in there. I am not leaving. I am right here. The low growl that answered her sent a fresh wave of fear through her body, deeper and more guttural than anything a human throat should be capable of producing. She heard him move, the chains rattling violently, his breathing now a ragged, animal panting that bore no resemblance to the careful, measured voice she had come to know over these past 3 days. Stay with me, Ronan, she said, forcing herself to take a single step closer, even as every fiber of her being urged the opposite. Your mother had a laugh that filled entire rooms, remember? Hold on to that. Hold on to anything that feels like yourself. For a moment, the growling faltered, and Alara felt a fragile spark of hope ignite within her chest. But then the sound returned, angrier, more chaotic than before, and she heard the sickening crack of stone beginning to give way beneath the strain of the chains. The chains will not hold him, she realized aloud, more to herself than anyone else, her mind racing to consider what options remained to her now. She thought quickly, drawing on everything they had discussed these past days, every detail Ronan had shared about the sensations preceding his transformation, searching desperately for something, anything, that might still reach whatever remained of the man beneath the beast, now straining against its restraints. Ronan, she said again, deliberately softening her voice, drawing on the same steady calm that had first caught his attention when she arrived at the castle, refusing to let him hear anything from her, except patience and quiet certainty. You once told me you feared becoming your father, spending your final years simply enduring, rather than living. You do not have to become that, Ronan. Not tonight. Not ever, if you do not choose it. The growling shifted subtly, something almost like confusion entering the sound, as though some fragment of reason still lingered beneath the chaos consuming him. Encouraged, Ilara continued speaking, her voice weaving together every memory, every shared confidence from these past days, anchoring him with the same patient steadiness she had used to guide her own way through a world she could not see. You told me you never believed anyone could offer you hope without flinching first, she said. I am not flinching now, Ronan. I am right here, and I am not afraid of you. I never have been. A sound tore from him then, somewhere between a growl and something almost human, pained and confused, as though two forces were battling within him for control. The chains rattled violently once more, and Ilara heard the distinct sound of stone crumbling, one of the anchor points giving way entirely beneath the strain. Her heart pounded with terror, but she forced herself to remain exactly where she stood, refusing to abandon the fragile thread of connection she could feel building between them, however tenuous it remained. Fight it, Ronan, she said, her voice steady, despite the danger clearly escalating around her. You are stronger than this curse believes you to be. I have seen it these past 3 days, in every conversation, every question you were willing to ask yourself for the first time in years. That strength is still there. Find it now. The room fell suddenly, eerily quiet, the growling ceasing entirely, replaced by a heavy, labored breathing that sounded almost pained in its intensity. Ilara held her breath, uncertain what this sudden silence might mean, whether it signaled progress or simply a brief pause before something far worse. Ilara, a voice finally said, rough and strained, but unmistakably his own, carrying none of the guttural violence from moments before. Ilara, is that truly you? Relief flooded through her so intensely that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. Yes, she said quickly, moving closer despite the lingering danger. Yes, Ronan, it is me. You are still here. You held on. I do not understand, he said, his voice still unsteady, carrying an exhaustion that seemed to reach into his very bones. I have never felt anything like this before. The beast was there, I could feel it consuming everything, and then your voice. It was as though something in me refused to let go entirely, refused to disappear, the way it always has before. You did not lose yourself, Ilara said. Tears she had not realized were forming, now slipping freely down her cheeks, relief and disbelief mingling together in equal measure. Ronan, you remained. Even at the height of the transformation, some part of you remained present enough to hear me, to fight for control. She heard him shift against the remaining chains, and though he was still bound, his movements now carried none of the violent chaos from before. The moon is still full tonight, he said, his voice cautious, as though testing whether the fragile control he had found might slip away again at any moment. I do not know if this will hold until dawn. Then we will continue exactly as we have been, Ilara said, settling herself onto the cold stone floor, near enough to reach him, though still respecting the boundary of caution they had established earlier. I will keep speaking to you, and you will keep listening, for as long as tonight demands of us both. They remained like that for hours, Ilara speaking softly of memories, of small details from her childhood in Ashwood, of stories her mother had once told her, anything that might help anchor Ronan's fragile hold on himself, as the night stretched on. Occasionally, she felt him tense, heard his breathing shift toward something more strained, more animal, and each time, she adjusted her voice, her words, finding whatever combination seemed to draw him back from the edge before the beast could fully reclaim control. By the time the first pale light of dawn began filtering through the high window above them, Ronan sat slumped against the wall, utterly exhausted but entirely himself, the chains hanging loose around him where the transformation had never fully claimed enough strength to break them completely. It is over, he said finally, his voice hoarse with exhaustion but steady, unmistakably human. The sun has risen. I feel the pull of the curse receding, the way it always does at dawn. You survived, Ilara said, relief washing through her so completely that she felt lightheaded with the force of it. We both did. You saved me, Ronan said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before, something raw and unguarded, stripped bare by the trials of the night just past. Ilara, in 3 years of this curse, in 3 sacrifices before you, nothing has ever changed. And tonight, because of you, Everything changed. "We do not yet know if it will hold," Alara said carefully, though she could not entirely suppress the hope blooming fiercely within her own chest. "One night is not proof that the curse is broken, Ronan. But it is proof that something can reach you, even at your worst. That alone is more than anyone believed possible before tonight." Ronan reached for her hand in the pale morning light, his grip trembling with exhaustion but sure, grateful, unmistakably human in every sense. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "I do not think I can ever repay what you have given me tonight." "You do not need to repay it," Alara said softly, "simply continuing to fight, each month, each time the moon rises, that will be enough." As servants began arriving to help clean the chamber and tend to their king, word of what had happened during the night began to spread quickly through the castle, whispered from servant to servant with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. For the first time in 3 years, the king had survived a full moon without violence, without destruction, without a life lost to the curse that had haunted the Shadowmere lands for generations. And at the center of that unprecedented change stood a blind peasant girl who had once been sent to the castle as nothing more than an offering to be discarded, now standing instead as the first person in living memory to prove that the king's curse might not be as absolute, as inescapable, as everyone had long believed it to be. Nessa arrived not long after dawn, breathless from hurrying through the corridors, having heard whispers among the other servants that something unusual had happened during the night. She found Alara still seated near Ronan, both of them exhausted but unmistakably alive and unharmed, and the young servant's eyes filled with tears at the sight. "You are truly well," Nessa said, kneeling quickly beside Alara, checking her over with careful hands, as though needing physical proof that no harm had come to her. "I did not sleep at all last night, listening for any sound from this chamber, fearing the worst with every passing hour." "I am well," Alara assured her, squeezing the younger woman's hand gratefully. "Better than well, in truth. Something extraordinary happened here tonight, Nessa." Word spread through the household with remarkable speed once Nessa returned to the kitchens, her account of finding both the king and Alara alive and unharmed, passing from servant to servant until it reached even the furthest corners of the castle staff. By mid-morning, a cautious energy had settled over the household, something Alara could sense even without seeing the faces around her, a fragile hope beginning to take root where only grim resignation had existed before. Ronan, still weakened from the night's ordeal, insisted on personally escorting Alara back to her chamber, once he had regained enough strength to walk steadily, waving away the servants who offered to assist him instead. "You should rest," Alara told him gently, as they made their way slowly through the quiet morning corridors. "You have been through more tonight than any ordinary person could withstand." "I will rest," Ronan agreed. "But first, I wanted to say something to you properly, without the chaos and exhaustion of the night still clouding my thoughts." He paused, just outside her chamber door, and Alara turned toward him, waiting. "You did not have to stay," he said quietly. "You could have run the moment the transformation began, and no one, least of all myself, would have blamed you for it. Instead, you remained, even as the danger grew more apparent with every passing moment. I do not fully understand why you chose to trust me so completely, but I am more grateful than I know how to express. I told you once that trust given carefully is rarely wasted entirely," Alara said. "I meant it, Ronan, and I do not regret the choice I made last night, not for a single moment, despite how frightened I truly was." "Word of what happened will spread quickly beyond these walls," Ronan said, a note of caution entering his voice. "The court will have questions. Some will be pleased, I imagine. Others may see this differently, as a threat to arrangements and traditions they have long depended upon. We will face those questions together, when they come," Alara said simply. "For now, I think we have both earned a little rest, after everything the night demanded of us." Ronan allowed himself a tired, genuine smile, the first she had heard, fully unguarded in his voice since they had met. "Rest sounds like exactly what we both need," he agreed, before reluctantly releasing her hand and making his way toward his own chambers, leaving Alara to settle into her bed and finally allow herself to feel the full weight of relief and exhaustion the night had left behind. She slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time since arriving at the castle, unaware that even as she rested, whispers were already beginning to travel through the corridors of power beyond the servants' quarters, reaching the ears of nobles and advisors who would not all share the same relief and hope that had settled over the household staff that morning. In the weeks that followed the first full moon, a quiet routine began to form between Ronan and Ilara, one built on the same careful honesty that had first drawn them together during those tense 3 days before the transformation. Ronan found himself seeking her out more frequently than he had anticipated, first with the excuse of discussing preparations for the next full moon, then simply because her presence had become something he looked forward to throughout his ordinary days, a warmth in his routine that had been entirely absent before her arrival. "You are here again," Ilara observed one afternoon, recognizing his footsteps as he entered the small library, where she had taken to spending her mornings, a servant reading aloud to her from various texts, while she absorbed the words with the same careful attention she brought to everything. "I find myself with fewer excuses each time," Ronan admitted, settling into the chair across from her, "though I continue to invent them regardless." "You do not need excuses to visit me, Ronan," Ilara said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I have grown rather fond of your company these past weeks, excuses or not." He was quiet for a moment, and she could hear the shift in his breathing, something careful and considering in the pause before he spoke again. "I have not felt this way in a very long time," he admitted. "Perhaps not ever, if I am entirely honest with myself. I had convinced myself, after the curse worsened and my father passed, that connection of this kind was simply not meant for someone in my position, that the burden I carried made genuine closeness with another person too dangerous to risk." "And now?" Ilara asked gently. "Now I find myself wondering whether I convinced myself of that belief, simply because it was easier than hoping for something different," he said. "You have shown me these past weeks that perhaps I was wrong to give up so completely." Their conversations continued in this manner over the following days, growing steadily more personal, more unguarded, as the careful walls Ronan had built around himself over years of isolation slowly began to lower in her presence. He told her of childhood memories from before the curse had fully claimed him, of afternoons spent with his father in the castle gardens before the weight of leadership and affliction had settled so heavily over both their lives. She told him of her own childhood, of the mother who had taught her to find beauty in a world she could not see directly, of the quiet resilience that had carried her through years of being overlooked and underestimated by nearly everyone she encountered. "You never once complained, in all these weeks," Ronan observed one evening, as they walked together through the castle gardens, a habit they had developed as the days grew warmer. "Not about your circumstances, not about being taken from your home so abruptly, not about any of it." "Complaining rarely changes anything," Ilara said simply. "I learned that lesson early in life. Better to accept what I could not change, and focus my energy instead on what remained within my control." "That is a remarkable kind of strength," Ronan said, and she could hear genuine admiration in his voice, unguarded in a way that made her chest tighten with an emotion she was only beginning to allow herself to name. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated when this arrangement first began, out of necessity rather than choice. Ronan began seeking her counsel on matters beyond the curse itself, discussing decisions of governance, disputes between noble families, questions of how best to support villages struggling after difficult harvests. Ilara, though she had no formal education in matters of ruling, brought a clarity of thought and genuine care for ordinary people that Ronan found himself relying upon more and more. "You understand the concerns of common people better than any advisor I have ever employed," he told her one afternoon, after she had offered a particularly insightful perspective on a dispute regarding grain distribution during a lean season. "Because you have lived among them, faced the same hardships they face, rather than simply observing from a position of comfort and privilege. I am glad I can offer something useful, beyond simply surviving the full moon each month," Ilara said, though there was a teasing warmth in her voice that had not existed during their earlier, more guarded conversations. "You offer far more than that," Ronan said quietly, "though I confess I sometimes struggle to find adequate words for exactly what you have come to mean to me." The second full moon arrived nearly a month after the first, and though both of them approached it with more confidence than before, having proven once that connection could anchor Ronan against the worst of the curse, neither entirely lost the fear that had accompanied that first attempt. This time, Ilara remained by his side from the very beginning of the transformation, her voice a steady, familiar presence he had come to associate with safety and calm, rather than the terror and violence that had once defined these nights. The second night proved easier than the first, though not without its own moments of tension, when the pull of the curse threatened to overwhelm the fragile control Ronan had begun to build. But Alara's presence, now familiar rather than new, seemed to anchor him more quickly, more completely, than it had during that first uncertain night, and by the time dawn broke over the castle once more, both of them emerged exhausted but unharmed, the second proof that something genuinely transformative had begun between them. 2 months now, Ronan said, as they sat together in the quiet aftermath of dawn, watching the pale light gradually fill the chamber where the ordeal had once again taken place. 2 months without the violence that has haunted these lands for years. I still find it difficult to believe entirely, even as I sit here experiencing the proof of it myself. Perhaps it is easier to believe, with each month that passes, Alara suggested. Proof builds upon proof, until eventually, even the deepest doubts begin to yield. I have begun to hope, Ronan admitted, that perhaps this curse might one day be broken entirely, rather than simply managed, as we have managed it these past months. Is that foolish of me, do you think? I do not think hope is ever foolish, Alara said firmly. Even when it is uncertain, even when the outcome remains unclear, hope gives us reason to keep trying, keep searching for answers we might otherwise abandon entirely. Word of the king's continued survival through 2 consecutive full moons without incident had, by this point, spread well beyond the castle walls, reaching villages throughout the Shadowmere lands, and stirring a cautious hope among people who had lived for years under the shadow of fear and sacrifice. Some began to whisper that perhaps the curse was finally weakening, that the blind peasant girl who had once been sent as an offering had somehow found a way to tame the beast that no healer or witch had ever managed to reach before her. Not everyone within the castle received this news with unqualified joy, however. Among certain members of the court, whispers of a different nature had begun to circulate, quiet conversations held behind closed doors, concerns raised about what this unexpected development might mean for carefully laid plans and long-standing arrangements that depended upon the king remaining unattached, available for whatever strategic marriage might eventually secure the kingdom's most valuable alliances. Lord Callum, the king's most senior advisor, watched the growing closeness between Ronan and Alara with an expression of carefully concealed concern, uncertain how to address a development that threatened the very foundations of political strategy he had spent years carefully constructing on behalf of the crown. This attachment grows more pronounced with each passing week, he confided quietly to another advisor one evening, as the 2 men observed Ronan and Alara walking together in the distant gardens below the castle window. The king has never shown this kind of devotion to anyone before, not even during his father's arranged courtships in years past. Perhaps it is simply gratitude, the other advisor suggested, though his tone carried little conviction. She saved his life, after all. Such things naturally create strong bonds between people. Perhaps, Lord Callum said, though the doubt in his voice suggested he believed this explanation to be far too simple for what he was witnessing unfold before him. Regardless, we would do well to monitor this situation carefully. The kingdom's stability depends upon careful alliances, and a peasant girl, however remarkable her apparent gifts, cannot offer the kind of political advantage this kingdom requires to remain secure against its rivals. Neither Ronan nor Alara were yet aware of these quiet concerns beginning to stir among the court's most influential figures, too absorbed in the fragile, precious connection they had built together over these past weeks to notice the storm clouds gathering slowly on the horizon of their newfound happiness. That evening, unaware of the conversation taking place between Lord Callum and his fellow advisor, Ronan sought out Alara in the small library where she often spent her quiet hours, finding her seated near the window, her fingers moving carefully over a piece of embroidery Nessa had recently taught her to create through touch alone. "You are becoming quite skilled at that," Ronan observed, settling into the chair beside her. "Nessa has been patient with me," Alara said, smiling as she continued her careful stitching. "It reminds me of the mending work my mother once taught me, though embroidery requires a far steadier hand than simple repairs ever did." "You carry every skill you learn with such quiet dedication," Ronan said. "I have noticed this about you since the very first night we met. Nothing seems to discourage you for long." "Discouragement rarely accomplishes anything useful," Alara replied. "I would rather spend my energy learning than mourning what comes difficult to me." Ronan watched her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded settling over his features. An expression Alara could not see, but somehow sensed in the softened quality of his silence. "Alara," he said finally, "I have been meaning to ask you something, though I confess, I have hesitated for reasons I am only now beginning to understand clearly myself." She paused her stitching, turning toward him with curious attention. "What is it?" "These past 2 months have changed something fundamental within me," he said, his voice carrying a rare vulnerability. "Before you arrived, I had resigned myself to a life of isolation, believing genuine connection was simply not possible for someone burdened as I am. You have shown me otherwise, not only through your courage during the full moon, but through every ordinary conversation we have shared since. I find myself, more each day, wishing this arrangement between us might become something more permanent than simply managing my curse together." Alara's breath caught, her fingers stilling entirely over the embroidery in her lap. "Ronan," she said carefully, "are you suggesting what I believe you are suggesting?" "I am not certain yet how to properly voice it," he admitted, a note of nervousness entering his tone that seemed almost endearing, coming from a man who ruled an entire kingdom with practiced authority in every other circumstance. "I only know that the thought of you eventually leaving this castle, once your obligation as this year's offering has technically ended, fills me with a dread I did not expect to feel so strongly." "I had not considered leaving," Alara said quietly. "Truthfully, I am not certain where I would go, even if I wished to. My home in Ashwood holds little for me now beyond memories, and Agnes, though I would dearly love to see her again someday." "Then perhaps," Ronan said carefully, "you might consider remaining here, not simply as the person who helps manage my curse each month, but as someone with a permanent place within these walls, within my life more broadly." Alara considered his words carefully, weighing the magnitude of what he was suggesting against the quiet contentment she had genuinely found in her weeks at the castle, weeks that had transformed her from a frightened sacrifice into something she had never expected to become, a trusted companion to the very king she had once feared meeting. "I would like that," she said finally, her voice steady despite the flutter of emotion building within her chest, "though I imagine such an arrangement may not be simple, given my circumstances and yours." "Nothing about our situation has ever been simple," Ronan said, a rare note of dry humor entering his voice. "I see no reason why this should be different, but I would rather face complications alongside you than continue avoiding happiness simply because it arrives in an unexpected form." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the weight of his suggestion settling gently between them, neither fully certain what challenges lay ahead, but both finding quiet reassurance in having spoken their feelings openly at last, after weeks of careful, unspoken understanding, building steadily beneath the surface of their daily conversations. Alara returned to her embroidery eventually, though her thoughts remained fixed on the conversation they had just shared, turning over the possibilities and uncertainties of a future she had never imagined for herself when the soldiers first arrived at her village to read her name from that fateful list. She thought of how far she had traveled, not merely in distance from Ashwood to this castle, but in circumstance, from someone considered expendable by her own community, to someone whose presence had begun to reshape the very fate of a kingdom burdened by an ancient curse. She did not yet know of the quiet concerns stirring among the king's advisors, the careful calculations already forming behind closed doors regarding what her growing influence might mean for arrangements far beyond her understanding or control. For now, she allowed herself simply to feel the warmth of Ronan's presence beside her, grateful for a connection she had never expected to find, in a place she had once believed would only bring her suffering and an early end to a life already marked by hardship and loss. 3 months after her arrival at the castle, Alara had settled into a life she could never have imagined during those first frightened hours waiting alone in that chamber, uncertain whether she would even survive to see the sunrise. Now she walked the corridors with familiar confidence, her presence accepted, even welcomed, by most of the household staff who had come to genuinely admire the quiet strength that had transformed their king's fate so dramatically. Not everyone shared this admiration, however. Alara first became aware of the tension building within the court, during a conversation she overheard entirely by accident, her keen hearing picking up voices from behind a partially closed door, as she passed through a corridor near the council chambers one afternoon. "The girl has no lineage, no political value whatsoever," a voice said, one Ilara did not immediately recognize, though she noted its cold, calculating tone. If the king continues down this path, he jeopardizes every alliance we have spent years carefully cultivating with the neighboring territories. He seems entirely devoted to her, another voice responded, one she recognized now as belonging to Lord Callum, the senior advisor she had encountered briefly on several occasions since her arrival. I have never seen him show such attachment to anyone, not even during the arranged courtships his father once attempted to establish in his youth. Devotion is a luxury kings cannot always afford, the first voice said sharply. Especially kings, burdened with curses that make their rule already precarious, in the eyes of rival territories seeking any excuse to challenge Shadowmere's stability. We must find a way to address this situation before it grows beyond our ability to manage it quietly. Ilara continued walking, careful not to alert them to her presence, her mind turning over what she had just heard with growing unease. She had known, in some quiet corner of her thoughts, that her closeness with Ronan might eventually draw attention from those concerned with matters of politics and power beyond the personal happiness the two of them had found together. Hearing it spoken aloud so plainly, however, brought a sharper edge of worry than she had previously allowed herself to acknowledge. She said nothing to Ronan about what she had overheard that afternoon, uncertain how to raise the matter without causing him unnecessary distress over concerns that might, in the end, amount to nothing more than idle court gossip. Instead, she carried the weight of this new knowledge quietly, watching more carefully in the following days for further signs of the tension she now knew existed beneath the surface of the court's outward courtesy toward her. The signs, once she began looking for them, were not difficult to find. Certain nobles who had previously greeted her with polite, if distant, respect, now seemed to regard her with a coolness that bordered on outright suspicion whenever she passed through the castle's more formal chambers. Conversations grew noticeably quieter when she entered rooms where advisors and nobles gathered, resuming only once she had moved safely out of earshot, or so they believed, unaware of how far her hearing could actually reach. "You seem troubled today," Nessa observed one morning, as she helped Ilara prepare for the day ahead, noting the slight tension in her charge's usually composed demeanor. "It is nothing," Ilara said, though she suspected Nessa, who had grown perceptive to her moods over these past months, was not entirely convinced by the deflection. "You know you can speak with me, if something is troubling you," Nessa said gently. "I may not be able to offer solutions, but I can at least offer an understanding ear." Ilara considered this offer carefully, before finally sharing what she had overheard, the concerns rippling through certain factions of the court, regarding her relationship with Ronan, and what it might mean for the kingdom's political stability. "I feared something like this might arise eventually," Nessa admitted, her expression growing serious. "The nobility here has long depended upon strategic marriages to maintain alliances and secure resources for the kingdom, a match born purely of genuine feeling, rather than calculated advantage, threatens the entire system many of them have built their influence upon." "Should I speak with Ronan about this?" Ilara asked, "or would that only cause him unnecessary worry, when perhaps nothing will come of these concerns beyond simple gossip?" Nessa considered this question thoughtfully. "I think," she finally said, "that the king deserves to know what challenges may lie ahead, particularly if those challenges might eventually threaten your safety, or the stability of what you have built together these past months. Secrets rarely serve anyone well, in my experience, especially secrets kept out of a desire to protect someone from difficult truths." Ilara took this advice to heart, though she found herself hesitating over the following days, uncertain how to broach the subject with Ronan, without disrupting the fragile peace and happiness they had built together since that first terrifying night of the full moon. She did not wish to burden him with fears that might, in the end, prove unfounded, particularly when he had already carried so much weight throughout his life, first from the curse itself, and now from the responsibilities of trying to build something genuine and lasting with her despite the obstacles surrounding them both. Her hesitation, however, would soon prove costly. Nearly 2 weeks after she first overheard that troubling conversation near the council chambers, Ilara found herself approached directly by a woman she did not recognize, her voice carrying the polished, careful cadence of someone accustomed to navigating the delicate politics of court life. "You are the girl who has captured our king's attention," the woman said, her tone carrying a thin veneer of politeness that did little to mask the underlying coldness Ilara detected immediately beneath the surface. I am Lady Vivienne, cousin to Lord Callum. I thought it might be worth speaking with you directly, given the circumstances that have developed since your arrival. I am pleased to meet you, Lady Vivienne, Alara said carefully, keeping her tone neutral, despite the wariness building within her at the woman's approach. I imagine you are aware, Lady Vivienne continued, that your relationship with the king has caused considerable concern among certain members of his court. Concern that, I fear, may not remain merely theoretical for very much longer. What do you mean by that? Alara asked, her earlier caution giving way to genuine alarm at the implicit threat she sensed lurking beneath the woman's carefully chosen words. Simply this, Lady Vivienne said, her voice dropping lower, taking on a harder edge beneath its polished exterior. There are those within this court who believe the kingdom's stability matters more than any king's personal happiness, however genuinely felt that happiness might be. I would advise you, for your own safety, to consider carefully whether remaining here, so visibly entangled with a king, burdened by curse and political vulnerability alike, is truly the wisest path forward for someone in your position. Are you threatening me? Alara asked directly, refusing to let fear creep into her voice, despite the very real unease building within her chest. I am simply offering honest counsel, Lady Vivienne said smoothly, from someone who understands far better than you the dangerous currents you have unknowingly waded into since your arrival at this castle. Not everyone within these walls wishes you well, whatever kindness the household staff and the king himself may have shown you these past months. I would suggest you remain vigilant, going forward. With that, Lady Vivienne turned and departed without another word, leaving Alara standing alone in the corridor, her heart pounding with a fear far different from anything she had experienced during those tense nights of the full moon. This threat was quieter, more insidious, carrying implications she could not fully grasp, but understood, instinctively, to be genuinely dangerous. She did not tell Ronan about this encounter that same evening, uncertain still how to raise the matter without causing him unnecessary alarm, particularly with the next full moon approaching within days and requiring both their careful preparation and undivided focus. But the weight of Lady Vivienne's warning settled heavily within her, a shadow now stretching across the fragile happiness she had found within these castle walls, reminding her that not every danger she faced here would arrive with the obvious ferocity of a curse transforming under moonlight. Some dangers, she was beginning to understand, wore far more elegant, far more patient disguises. That night, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep, Alara sat by her window, listening to the distant sounds of the castle grounds below, turning Lady Vivienne's words over and over in her mind, searching for some way to understand the true scope of the danger she now faced. She thought of writing to Agnes, the only person from her old life who might offer genuine counsel, though she knew any letter would take days to reach Ashwood, and days more for a reply to return, time she was not certain she could afford to spend waiting. Instead, she resolved to speak with Nessa again the following morning, hoping the young servant might have insight into who exactly stood behind the concerns Lady Vivienne had voiced so carefully, and what form any genuine threat might eventually take. Lady Vivienne, Nessa repeated the following day, her expression darkening with recognition when Alara described the encounter. She is not someone to dismiss lightly, Alara. Her family holds considerable influence within the court, and she has long been known for pursuing her ambitions through quiet manipulation, rather than open confrontation. If she approached you directly, it means the concerns among the nobility have grown serious enough that they no longer wish to remain entirely hidden from you. What do you think they might attempt? Alara asked, her earlier unease sharpening into something closer to genuine fear. I do not know for certain, Nessa admitted, but I have heard whispers, nothing confirmed, only rumors, passed carefully between servants who overhear more than the nobility often realizes. Some speak of arranging a match between the king and a noblewoman from a neighboring territory, hoping perhaps to force the issue before your influence grows any stronger. Others speak of more drastic measures, though I hesitate to repeat such things without more certain knowledge behind them. Drastic measures, Alara repeated slowly, a chill settling over her at the implication carried within those words. I do not wish to frighten you unnecessarily, Nessa said quickly, seeing the concern deepening across Alara's features. But I think, given what Lady Vivienne has already said to you directly, it would be wise to tell the king what has occurred. He deserves to know, and he may have more insight than either of us into how seriously these threats should be regarded. Ilara considered this advice carefully throughout the remainder of that day, weighing her reluctance to burden Ronan against the very real possibility that remaining silent might leave them both more vulnerable to whatever the court's more ambitious factions were quietly planning. By evening, when Ronan came to find her in the castle gardens, where she had taken to spending her quiet hours reflecting among the fragrant blooms she could not see but had come to know intimately through scent and touch, she finally resolved to share what had transpired. "You seem distracted this evening," Ronan observed, settling beside her on the stone bench where she sat, the cool evening air, carrying the scent of late-blooming roses between them. "There is something I should have told you sooner," Ilara admitted, and she recounted, as carefully and completely as she could, both the conversation she had overheard near the council chambers weeks earlier and her more recent encounter with Lady Vivian. Ronan listened in silence, his expression, though she could not see it, growing increasingly tense as she spoke, his breathing shifting into something sharper, more controlled, the way she had come to recognize as anger carefully restrained. "I should have anticipated this," he said finally, his voice tight. "I have been so absorbed in the hope our progress with the curse has given me, that I failed to consider how threatening that same progress might appear to those within my court, who depend upon my remaining unattached for their own political purposes. I did not wish to burden you unnecessarily," Ilara said, "particularly with the full moon approaching so soon. But Nessa convinced me that keeping silent might leave us both more vulnerable rather than less." "Nessa was right to convince you," Ronan said firmly, reaching for her hand in the fading evening light. "Ilara, I need you to understand that whatever threats Lady Vivian or anyone else within my court might attempt, I will not allow them to harm you, or to force us apart simply to preserve arrangements that matter far less to me than what we have built together these past months." "I believe you," Ilara said, though the tremor of genuine fear still lingered beneath her words. "But I do not fully understand what we are facing, Ronan. Lady Vivian spoke of danger, but offered nothing specific enough to prepare against." "I will speak with Lord Callum directly," Ronan said, his voice hardening with resolve. "If concerns exist within my court regarding our relationship, I would rather address them openly than allow them to fester quietly into something far more dangerous, as they clearly have already begun to do." They sat together in the gathering darkness a while longer, the weight of this new challenge settling heavily between them, though neither allowed it to entirely overshadow the quiet comfort they had come to find in each other's presence over these past months. Ilara found herself grateful, despite the fear now coiling within her chest, that she had finally shared this burden, rather than carrying it alone, trusting that whatever storm was gathering around them, they would face it together, exactly as they had faced the curse itself, each full moon since her arrival. The diplomatic visit had been planned for months, long before Ilara's arrival at the castle, a gathering meant to strengthen ties between the Shadowmere lands and the neighboring territory of Greymore, whose ruler, Lord Edmund, had grown increasingly ambitious in recent years, seeking any advantage that might expand his own influence at the expense of his neighbors. Ronan had explained the significance of this visit to Ilara only days before the delegation's arrival, his tone carrying a caution she had not heard from him in weeks. "Lord Edmund has never been an ally in any true sense," he told her, as they walked together through the castle's great hall, servants bustling around them making final preparations for the formal reception. "He tolerates peace with Shadowmere only so long as he perceives no weakness he might exploit. I fear this visit may test us in ways beyond simple diplomatic courtesy." "Do you believe he already knows about the curse?" Ilara asked. "Everyone in the neighboring territories knows some version of the rumors," Ronan admitted. "But knowing rumors and possessing proof are very different matters. I have worked carefully these past years to ensure no one beyond my own court has ever witnessed the transformation directly. I fear that carefulness may be tested during this visit, given the timing." Ilara felt a chill of understanding settle over her. "The full moon," she said. "It falls during the days of his visit." "Yes," Ronan confirmed grimly. "I had hoped to reschedule the diplomatic gathering, but doing so without adequate explanation would only raise further suspicion. I believed, given our success these past months, that we could manage the transformation quietly, away from Lord Edmund's watchful eyes, exactly as we have managed it each month since your arrival. But you no longer believe that will be possible," Ilara said, hearing the tension still lingering in his voice. "I do not know," Ronan admitted. "Lord Edmund does not travel without purpose, Ilara. I fear his timing here is no accident, that he suspects something and intends to use this visit to confirm those suspicions, whatever the cost to the fragile peace between our territories. The delegation arrived 2 days later. Lord Edmund himself, a tall, calculating man whose polite courtesies carried an unmistakable undercurrent of cold ambition that even Alara, without sight to observe his expressions directly, could sense clearly, in the careful precision of his voice and the deliberate pauses he employed throughout every conversation, as though constantly measuring the value of each word before releasing it. Your kingdom has flourished remarkably well, despite the burdens I understand you carry, King Ronan, Lord Edmund said during the formal welcoming feast, his tone smooth but pointed enough that Alara felt Ronan tense beside her at the table. Shadowmere has always found strength in adversity, Lord Edmund, Ronan replied carefully. I trust your own territories continue to prosper as well. Indeed, Lord Edmund said, his attention shifting deliberately toward Alara, seated beside the king, in a position of honor that had raised more than a few eyebrows among the visiting delegation. And who is this remarkable companion you have brought to join us this evening? I understand she holds quite an unusual position within your court. This is Alara, Ronan said, his voice carrying careful warmth despite the underlying tension Alara could sense building around them. She has become an invaluable presence within Shadowmere these past months. Invaluable indeed, from what I have heard, Lord Edmund said, his tone carrying an edge that made Alara's unease sharpen considerably. Rumors travel quickly between territories, King Ronan. Even rumors concerning matters kingdoms typically prefer to keep carefully private. The feast continued with careful, guarded conversation on both sides, Alara sensing the underlying tension stretching taut between Ronan and his guest throughout the remainder of the evening, though neither man allowed the surface courtesies to fully crack under the strain of whatever silent contest of wills was unfolding between them. The following evening, the night of the full moon arrived, and with it, the crisis Ronan had feared, from the moment he learned of the timing of Lord Edmund's visit. Ronan had arranged, as carefully as circumstances allowed, to withdraw from the formal gathering early, citing exhaustion from the day's diplomatic discussions, intending to reach the private chamber where Alara would help him manage the transformation, away from any prying eyes. But as they made their way quietly through a side corridor, Alara heard footsteps following them, deliberate and unhurried, the confident pace of someone who had anticipated exactly this movement and prepared accordingly. Leaving so early, King Ronan? Lord Edmund's voice called out behind them, carrying clearly through the empty corridor. I had hoped we might continue our conversation from earlier this evening. I am afraid I must retire, Lord Edmund, Ronan said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the tension Alara could feel radiating from him. We can continue our discussions tomorrow, once I have rested sufficiently. Of course, Lord Edmund said, though his tone carried no genuine acceptance of this excuse. Though I confess, I have heard such curious rumors about the nature of your condition, King Ronan. I find myself increasingly curious whether tonight might offer some opportunity to witness the truth behind them myself. Alara felt Ronan's entire body tense beside her, understanding immediately the danger contained within Lord Edmund's carefully chosen words. I do not know what rumors you refer to, Ronan said, his voice hardening slightly. Come now, Lord Edmund said, moving closer, his footsteps echoing with unhurried confidence through the corridor. Every territory bordering Shadowmere has heard whispers of a curse plaguing your bloodline, King Ronan, a curse that transforms you into something dangerous each full moon. I find it remarkable that such rumors persist so consistently across so many independent sources, unless there is some genuine truth behind them. Rumors are rarely reliable sources of truth, Lord Edmund, Ronan said, though Alara could hear the strain building in his voice. The tightening she had come to associate with the early stages of his transformation, already beginning to take hold, worsened, perhaps, by the stress of this unexpected confrontation. Perhaps, Lord Edmund said, or perhaps you simply hope I will believe that, while concealing a truth that might significantly alter the balance of power between our territories, should it become widely known that Shadowmere's king suffers from an affliction that renders him dangerous, even monstrous, under specific conditions. Ronan, Alara said quietly, sensing the transformation accelerating within him, the familiar tightness entering his breathing, that signaled the curse was already beginning to claim hold of him, worsened significantly by the confrontation and the stress it carried. We need to reach the chamber now, But it was already too late. Lord Edmund, watching closely, noted the sudden change in Ronan's posture, the way his breathing grew ragged, his hands beginning to tremble, with something far beyond ordinary exhaustion. "It is happening now, isn't it?" Lord Edmund said, his voice carrying a note of triumphant discovery beneath its careful composure. "Guards, come quickly. Witness this for yourselves." Several guards from Lord Edmund's own delegation appeared swiftly at his summons, along with members of the castle's own household staff drawn by the commotion, and Alara felt the situation spiraling rapidly beyond anything she or Ronan could control, the very worst possible circumstance unfolding, before an audience of witnesses who had no understanding of what they were about to see, or how genuinely dangerous the moment had become. "Ronan," she said urgently, gripping his arm despite the growing tremor she felt beneath her hand, "listen to my voice, exactly as you have every month before this one. Do not let their presence distract you from finding your way back to yourself." The gathered witnesses watched in shocked silence as Ronan's transformation began to take visible hold, his eyes shifting color even in the dim corridor light, his frame seeming to grow larger, more powerful, more dangerous with every passing moment, exactly as the old rumors had always described, but few had ever witnessed directly with their own eyes. "You see it now," Lord Edmund said triumphantly to the gathered witnesses, though his own composure had grown noticeably more cautious as the reality of the transformation unfolded more dramatically than perhaps even he had anticipated. "The curse is real, exactly as I suspected. Shadowmere's king is nothing more than a beast wearing the crown of a man." "He is not simply a beast," Alara said firmly, refusing to let fear overtake her voice, despite the danger clearly building around them, the guards shifting nervously, weapons half drawn, uncertain whether they should intervene or simply flee before the transformation completed entirely. "Watch, and you will see something none of you have ever witnessed before." She turned her full attention back toward Ronan, ignoring the growing murmur of fear and confusion among the witnesses gathered around them, focusing entirely on the steady, familiar rhythm of connection that had anchored him successfully through every full moon these past months. "Ronan," she said, her voice cutting through the tension of the corridor with practiced calm. "I am here. Hold on to my voice, exactly as you have before. Do not let their fear become your own." The transformation continued its relentless progress, Ronan's breathing growing more animal, more ragged, his hands curling into something closer to claws than fingers, and the gathered witnesses drew back further, several crying out in alarm, convinced they were about to witness exactly the violence the old rumors had always described. But then, slowly, something began to shift. The wild, ragged breathing that had grown steadily more animal began, gradually, to steady itself, matching, however imperfectly, the calm rhythm of Alara's continued words. The guards watching nearby noticed the change first, murmuring among themselves in confused uncertainty, uncertain whether to feel relief or continued alarm at the strange sight unfolding before them, a king caught between man and beast, seemingly anchored by nothing more than the steady voice of a blind girl, who did not so much as flinch, despite the very real danger surrounding her. "That is not possible," Lord Edmund said, his earlier triumph giving way to genuine confusion as he watched the transformation stall, neither completing fully nor receding entirely, held instead in a strange, unprecedented balance. None of the gathered witnesses had ever seen described in any account of the curse before this moment. The curse does not simply pause, it consumes entirely, or it does not touch a man at all. This is not how the affliction has ever been described. "Perhaps," Alara said, her voice remaining steady despite the strain evident in her own posture. "The affliction has simply never been properly understood before now, Lord Edmund. Perhaps everyone who ever witnessed this curse assumed there was no reaching the man beneath it, because no one ever truly tried." She continued speaking softly to Ronan, ignoring the gathered audience entirely now, focusing only on the familiar anchor points they had built together these past months. Memories of his mother's laugh, the quiet strength of his father's final years, the shared conversations that had slowly rebuilt something within him that fear alone had never been able to reach. Gradually, over what felt like an agonizingly long stretch of minutes, though it likely lasted only a fraction of that time, Ronan's breathing steadied fully, his posture straightening back toward its usual composed bearing, his eyes slowly returning to their natural color under the dim corridor light. The guards who had drawn weapons in alarm slowly lowered them, exchanging uncertain glances with one another, uncertain what exactly they had just witnessed. "The curse remains," Ronan said finally, his voice hoarse but unmistakably his own, addressing the gathered witnesses directly, with a composure that belied the ordeal he had just endured before their very eyes. "I will not pretend otherwise, Lord Edmund, but you have just witnessed something no account of this affliction has ever described. Connection, genuine and steady, can reach even the depths of this curse, when fear alone has always failed." Lord Edmund studied Ronan carefully, his earlier confidence replaced now by something more calculating, reassessing the situation with the careful precision of a man accustomed to weighing political advantage from every new piece of information available to him. "This changes considerably what I understood about your situation, King Ronan," he said slowly. "I had believed I would find weakness here tonight, an affliction to exploit for Greymoor's advantage. Instead, I find something else entirely, perhaps something even more formidable than the fearsome reputation your curse has always carried." "Then perhaps," Ronan said, his voice steadying further with each passing moment, "you will reconsider whatever plans you arrived here, intending to pursue, Lord Edmund, now that you have witnessed firsthand that Shadowmere's strength runs deeper than any curse might threaten to undermine." Lord Edmund said nothing further for a long moment, studying both Ronan and Alara with an expression Alara could not see but sensed carried grudging reassessment rather than continued hostility. "It would seem," he finally said, "that I owe you both an apology for the manner of tonight's confrontation, however illuminating it has ultimately proven. I had not anticipated witnessing something quite so remarkable." He withdrew shortly after, along with his own guards and attendants, leaving the castle's household staff to quietly disperse as well, though not before word of what they had witnessed began spreading rapidly through every corner of the household, and eventually, in the days that followed, throughout the wider court, and beyond its walls entirely. "That was far too close," Ronan said quietly, once they were finally alone in the corridor, exhaustion evident in every line of his voice, despite the relief also clearly present beneath it. "I feared, for several terrible moments, that Lord Edmund's provocation might undo everything we have built these past months. But it did not," Alara said firmly, reaching for his hand in the quiet aftermath. "If anything, Ronan, what happened tonight proves something even more valuable than our private successes these past months ever could. Now there are witnesses, people beyond the walls of this castle, who saw with their own eyes that the curse can be reached, can be managed, rather than simply feared and endured. Word will spread quickly now," Ronan said, "beyond anything we could have controlled ourselves." "Perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing," Alara said gently. "Secrets carry their own dangers, Ronan. Perhaps it is time the truth of what we have discovered together finally reaches beyond these walls, rather than remaining hidden out of fear of how others might react to it." They made their way back toward their private chambers slowly, both exhausted from the ordeal of the evening, but carrying with them a fragile new confidence that the path they had chosen together, however uncertain and challenging it remained, was proving stronger with each test it endured, stronger than either of them had dared to hope when this journey first began within the walls of that lonely chamber so many months before. In the weeks following Lord Edmund's departure, a curious shift began to settle over the castle and, gradually, the wider kingdom beyond it. What had once been carefully guarded rumor now moved openly through conversation, villagers speaking with cautious hope about a king whose curse, it seemed, might not be the absolute and inescapable affliction it had always been believed to be. Ronan, encouraged by this shift and by the confidence that had grown steadily between himself and Alara, resolved to pursue something he had abandoned years earlier as a fruitless endeavor, a deeper search into the true origins of the curse itself, hoping that understanding its foundation might reveal a path toward breaking it entirely, rather than simply managing its effects each month. "My father searched for years and found nothing conclusive," Ronan told Alara, as they sat together in his private study, surrounded by the same dusty volumes he had begun revisiting the night after their first conversation months earlier. "But I confess, I do not believe he searched with the same understanding we now possess. That connection itself might hold some key to reaching the curse, in ways force and fear never could." "Where should we begin looking?" Alara asked. "There are old records," Ronan said, "kept in the deepest archives of the castle, detailing the history of my family's rule over these lands. Somewhere within them, I believe, lies an account of when this curse first began, and why, My father found fragments of the story, but never enough to fully understand its origin. Over the following days, Ronan and Alara spent long hours in the castle's deepest archives, Ronan reading aloud from ancient texts while Alara listened carefully, her sharp memory and careful attention often catching details Ronan himself might have overlooked in his more hurried searches of years past. The story, when they finally pieced it together from fragments scattered across several different volumes, proved older and more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Generations earlier, Ronan's ancestor, a king named Aldrich the Elder, had made a promise to a woman living at the edge of the Shadowmere lands, a woman with knowledge of old magic that the villagers of that era had both feared and respected in equal measure. The promise, according to the fragmented accounts, involved protection for her family and land, in exchange for her guidance, during a time of great hardship facing the kingdom. He broke the promise, Ronan said quietly, reading the final fragments of the account with a heaviness settling into his voice. Once the hardship passed and the kingdom recovered its strength, Aldrich the Elder decided her land held strategic value he no longer wished to share, and he seized it from her family entirely, breaking the promise he had made in a moment of desperate need. And she cursed his bloodline in response, Alara guessed, understanding now the shape of the tragedy that had shaped generations of Blackthorn rulers since that broken promise so long ago. Yes, Ronan confirmed. The account describes her fury, her declaration that his bloodline would forever carry within it a beast as untamed and untrustworthy as the promise he had broken so carelessly. She wished for his descendants to understand, generation after generation, what it felt like to be betrayed by the very people meant to protect and honor them. That is a heavy inheritance to carry, Alara said softly, understanding now, with painful clarity, the weight Ronan had carried his entire life, punishment for a sin committed by an ancestor he had never known, a broken promise made long before his own birth. The account offers one final detail, Ronan continued, his voice carrying a note of cautious hope Alara had not heard from him before. It suggests the curse might be lessened, though perhaps never fully erased, through acts of genuine loyalty and connection offered freely, without expectation of reward, mirroring the very trust that was originally broken to create this affliction in the first place. That is precisely what we have been building these past months, Alara said, her own voice carrying a rising excitement at the implications of this discovery. Trust given freely, without conditions. Perhaps that is exactly why our efforts have succeeded where so many others failed before us. Ronan closed the ancient volume carefully, setting it aside as he turned to face her fully, though she could not see the intensity of emotion now settling over his features. If this account is accurate, he said slowly, then perhaps the curse might be broken entirely, not simply managed month after month as we have done thus far, but genuinely ended, freeing my bloodline from a burden generations of my family have carried since that broken promise so long ago. What would that require? Alara asked. The account does not say precisely, Ronan admitted. Only that genuine loyalty and connection, freely given, might accomplish what force and fear alone could never achieve. I confess, Alara, I do not fully understand what more such a thing might require beyond what we have already built together these past months. They sat together in thoughtful silence for a long while after that discovery, both turning over the possibilities and uncertainties this new knowledge presented. For the first time since the curse had claimed his life so completely, Ronan allowed himself to imagine a future entirely free from its shadow, a future where the full moon held no more danger than any other night, where his children, should he ever have any, would never inherit the burden that had shaped so much of his own life and the lives of his ancestors before him. I do not wish to place undue pressure upon what we have built together, Ronan said carefully, breaking the silence that had settled between them. But Alara, if this account holds truth, if genuine connection freely given might finally break this curse entirely, I find myself wondering whether what we share together might be exactly the answer generations of my family have searched for in vain. I do not offer my presence here out of obligation, Ronan, Alara said firmly. I have not. Since that very first night, when I chose to remain in that chamber, despite every reasonable instinct urging me to run. Whatever I offer you, I offer freely, because I have come to care for you deeply, beyond anything I could have imagined when I first arrived at this castle, believing I would simply be discarded as an offering to a curse I did not yet understand. Then perhaps, Ronan said, his voice thick with an emotion that carried both hope and vulnerability in equal measure. "We are closer to breaking this curse entirely than either of us dared to believe possible." Their research continued in the days that followed, seeking any further detail that might clarify precisely what breaking the curse fully would require, though the ancient accounts offered little additional guidance beyond what they had already discovered. Ronan began to suspect that perhaps the answer was simpler than either of them had initially assumed, that the curse itself responded not to complicated rituals or specific actions, but simply to the presence of a bond built on trust and genuine care, sustained consistently over time, rather than tested only during the brief crisis of each month's full moon. As the next full moon approached, both of them approached its arrival with a mixture of their usual careful preparation and a new, cautious hope that perhaps, this time, something more permanent might finally be achieved, that the curse haunting Ronan's bloodline for so many generations might finally begin its long overdue unraveling, freeing him at last from a burden he had carried since long before he ever understood what it truly meant to be cursed. Word of their discovery in the archives, however, did not remain contained within the walls of the study for long. Servants who assisted in retrieving certain volumes from the deepest shelves had overheard fragments of conversation, and within days, whispers of what Ronan and Alara had uncovered began circulating through the household staff, eventually reaching ears far less sympathetic to the prospect of the curse being broken entirely. Lord Callum received this news with an expression of genuine alarm, quickly seeking out Lady Vivian to discuss what this development might mean for the careful arrangements they had spent months quietly constructing. "If the curse can truly be broken," Lord Callum said, his voice tight with concern as the two of them spoke privately within his chambers, "then the king will have no further reason to fear ruling entirely alone. His attachment to the girl will only deepen, and any hope of arranging a more advantageous match will be lost entirely. We must act before that happens," Lady Vivian said, her earlier careful diplomacy giving way now to something harder, more determined. "I had hoped my warning to the girl might convince her to remove herself from this situation quietly, but she has proven more stubborn than I anticipated. Perhaps it is time to consider more direct measures." "What do you propose?" Lord Callum asked, though his tone carried clear unease at the direction this conversation was heading. "The full moon approaches again within days," Lady Vivian said. "If the girl were to be unavailable during that time, the king would face the transformation alone once more, exactly as he did before her arrival. Perhaps a reminder of what awaits him without her presence might convince him to reconsider the wisdom of pursuing this attachment so single-mindedly." "You mean to remove her during the very moment the king needs her most," Lord Callum said slowly, understanding the full weight of what Lady Vivian was suggesting. "That is a dangerous game, Vivian. If something happens to him during the transformation, if he loses control entirely without her presence to anchor him, the consequences could be catastrophic, not only for him, but for the kingdom itself. Sometimes difficult measures are required to preserve the greater stability of the realm," Lady Vivian said coldly. "I do not take this decision lightly, Callum, but I believe it necessary, before this attachment grows any further beyond our ability to manage or reverse it." Neither of them noticed Nessa passing quietly in the corridor outside, having come to deliver a message to Lord Callum regarding an unrelated matter, freezing, as she overheard fragments of their conversation, through the partially open door. She withdrew quickly and quietly, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had just learned, understanding immediately the danger this conversation represented for both Alara and the king she served. She found Alara later that same afternoon, seated in the castle gardens among the fragrant blooms she had come to know so intimately, and relayed what she had overheard with barely contained urgency. "They mean to separate us during the full moon," Alara said slowly, processing the full implications of what Nessa had just shared with growing alarm. "If I am not present when the transformation begins, Ronan will face it entirely alone, exactly as he did before I arrived. We must tell him immediately," Nessa urged. "Whatever they are planning, he deserves to know the danger before it arrives, rather than being caught unprepared as he was during Lord Edmund's visit." Alara agreed immediately, and the two women hurried to find Ronan, who received the news with an expression of controlled fury that Alara could sense clearly in the sharp edge suddenly present in his voice. "They would risk the safety of my entire kingdom," he said, his tone carrying barely restrained anger, simply to preserve their own political ambitions and outdated arrangements. This cannot be allowed to continue unchecked. What will you do? Alara asked. I will confront them directly, Ronan said, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. But first, we must ensure that whatever they attempt during the coming full moon, they will not succeed in separating us when it matters most. I will not allow their scheming to undo everything we have built together these past months. Nor will I allow them to gamble recklessly with the safety of everyone within these castle walls, simply to serve their own narrow interests. The days leading up to the full moon passed with a tension neither of them had experienced since those first uncertain nights so many months earlier, both aware now that the coming confrontation would test not only the strength of the bond they had built together, but the very future of Ronan's rule over the Shadowmere lands, and whether that rule would finally be freed from the shadow of a curse that had haunted his bloodline for far too many generations already. The day of the full moon arrived under a sky heavy with gathering clouds, and Alara could feel the tension throughout the castle building steadily as evening approached, servants moving with unusual quietness through the corridors, aware, even if only through rumor and instinct, that something significant was about to unfold within these walls. Ronan had spent the morning in careful preparation, not only for the transformation itself, but for the confrontation he intended to have with Lord Callum and Lady Vivian before the moon rose fully. He gathered his most trusted guards, those who had served the Blackthorn family loyally for years, without ever wavering in their devotion, and instructed them to ensure that Alara remained safely near him throughout the evening, regardless of whatever attempts might be made to separate them. I do not wish to believe they would truly risk such danger, Ronan admitted to Alara as they prepared together in his private chambers that afternoon. But I have learned, these past months, that fear and ambition can drive people toward choices they might never otherwise consider reasonable. We are prepared for whatever they attempt, Alara said, reaching for his hand with the same steady confidence that had first anchored him during that very first transformation so many months before. Whatever happens tonight, Ronan, I do not intend to let them separate us, not after everything we have built together. As evening settled over the castle, Lord Callum and Lady Vivian made their move, exactly as Nessa had overheard them planning days earlier. A group of guards loyal to Lady Vivian's family attempted to intercept Alara as she made her way toward the chamber where Ronan would soon begin his transformation, citing a fabricated urgent matter requiring her immediate attention elsewhere within the castle. But Ronan's own guards, forewarned and vigilant, recognized the attempted deception immediately, standing firm against Lady Vivian's men and refusing to allow Alara to be separated from her intended path. This is exactly the interference I feared, Ronan said, arriving swiftly at the scene alongside additional guards once word reached him of the confrontation building in the corridor. His voice carried a authority Alara had rarely heard from him before, the full weight of his kingship finally asserting itself against those who had sought to undermine him quietly from within his own court. Lord Callum, seeing his plan already unraveling before it could fully take shape, stepped forward with an expression of careful, practiced diplomacy, though Alara could hear the underlying nervousness now present in his voice. Your Majesty, we acted only out of genuine concern for the stability of your kingdom. Surely you understand the necessity of maintaining certain traditions and arrangements that have long secured Shadowmere's strength. What I understand, Ronan said, his voice cutting through Lord Callum's careful words with unmistakable authority, is that you and Lady Vivian conspired to place my safety, and the safety of everyone within these walls, at grave risk, simply to preserve your own ambitions regarding political marriage and influence. This is not loyalty to Shadowmere, Callum. This is a betrayal of everything a king's advisor is meant to protect. Lady Vivian, who had remained silent until this point, finally spoke, her earlier confidence giving way to something more defensive. We believed, Your Majesty, that removing the girl's influence, even briefly, might remind you of the greater responsibilities you carry as king, responsibilities that extend far beyond personal happiness. You believed wrong, Ronan said firmly. Alara has done more to secure Shadowmere's strength these past months than any political marriage or careful arrangement your family has ever proposed. She has shown me, and now shown this entire kingdom, that the curse haunting my bloodline can be reached, can be managed, and perhaps, if what we have recently discovered proves true, can finally be broken entirely. That is a gift beyond any measure of political advantage you might have hoped to secure through outdated traditions. The moon was rising steadily now, and Ronan could feel the familiar tightening beginning within his chest, the first signs of the transformation approaching despite the tension of the confrontation still unfolding around them. "We do not have time for further discussion," he said, his voice growing more urgent. "The moon rises, and I will not risk facing it while distracted by matters that should have been settled through honest conversation, rather than schemes and deception." He turned to his guards. "Lord Callum and Lady Vivian will remain here, under guard, until I have determined the appropriate consequences for tonight's actions. For now, Elara and I must proceed to the chamber, before the transformation progresses any further." Elara took his arm without hesitation, and together they made their way quickly toward the familiar chamber where they had faced so many full moons before, the guards ensuring no further interference would reach them as they went. Once inside, with the door secured firmly behind them, Ronan turned to Elara, his breathing already growing more labored as the transformation continued its relentless approach. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, his voice carrying both urgency and a deep, unwavering trust, "I am grateful beyond words that their scheme did not succeed in separating us when it mattered most." "Nothing will separate us tonight," Elara said firmly, guiding him toward the familiar position near the center of the chamber, where they had weathered so many transformations together already. "Focus on my voice, Ronan, exactly as you have every month since that very first night. Let us discover together whether tonight might finally be the night this curse begins its final unraveling." The transformation began as it always had, the tightening in his chest, the blurring of his thoughts, the low growl building steadily in his throat as the beast within him stirred toward the surface. But this time, Elara noticed something different almost immediately, a resistance in the process itself, as though the curse struggled against something it had never encountered so completely before, the full weight of months of genuine trust and connection, now standing firmly against its hold. "I can feel it," Ronan gasped, his voice straining but somehow clearer than it had been during previous transformations. "Elara, something is different tonight. The pull feels weaker, as though it cannot fully claim hold of me the way it once did." "Hold on to that feeling," Elara urged, moving closer, despite the lingering danger, her voice steady and sure. "Remember everything we have built together. Ronan, remember the promise broken generations ago, and the promise we have kept steadily to each other, every day since I arrived at this castle. Let that promise be stronger than the curse born from betrayal so long before either of us was born." The struggle continued for what felt like hours, though the tightness of the transformation never fully consumed him the way it had during that very first night so many months earlier. Instead, Ronan seemed to hover in a strange, unprecedented balance, neither fully man nor fully beast, caught between the pull of an ancient curse and the steady anchor of genuine connection, freely given and faithfully maintained. As the night wore on, Elara continued speaking softly, weaving together every shared memory, every quiet moment of trust they had built steadily, since that very first frightened night, in this same chamber, refusing to let the curse claim victory over what they had built together, with such patient, deliberate care. Slowly, as the deepest hours of night gave way toward the earliest signs of approaching dawn, something within Ronan finally seemed to settle entirely, the tension in his frame easing gradually, until he stood before her, breathing steadily, his voice returning fully to its familiar, gentle timbre. "Elara," he said softly, wonder evident in his voice, "I believe something has changed permanently tonight. I do not feel the lingering pull that has always remained, even after previous transformations passed. It feels gone, entirely gone." Elara reached for him, tears of relief and disbelief slipping freely down her cheeks, as she felt the truth of his words, confirmed in the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing, unmarked by any trace of the strain that had always lingered after previous full moons. "The curse," she said softly. "I believe it has finally been broken, Ronan, just as the old accounts suggested it might be, through genuine connection and trust freely given." They remained together in the quiet chamber as dawn broke fully over the castle, neither quite believing yet the full weight of what had been accomplished. Generations of suffering finally brought to an end, through nothing more than patient, steady devotion, offered without condition or expectation. In the days that followed, word of the curse's breaking spread rapidly throughout the kingdom, carrying with it a wave of celebration and relief that reached every village under Shadowmere's protection, including, eventually, the small village of Ashwood, where Agnes received the news with tears of joy, for the girl she had once feared she would never see again. Ronan addressed his court formally within the week, announcing not only the breaking of the ancient curse that had haunted his bloodline for generations, but also his intention to marry Alara, the woman whose courage and steady devotion had accomplished what generations of healers, witches, and desperate kings had never managed to achieve. Lord Callum and Lady Vivian, stripped of their positions of influence following their attempted interference, were exiled from the court entirely, though Ronan, in a display of the very mercy that had come to define his changed rule, allowed them to retain their lives and modest holdings, choosing forgiveness over the harsher justice his position would have permitted him to pursue. The wedding took place in early autumn, beneath a sky clear of clouds, the entire kingdom gathering to celebrate the union of their king and the blind peasant girl who had once been sent to the castle as nothing more than an offering to be discarded, now standing instead as their beloved queen, the woman whose quiet strength had finally tamed a beast that fear and force had never once managed to reach. Alara stood before the gathered crowd that day, unable to see the joy reflected on so many faces around her, but feeling it nonetheless, in the warmth of the autumn sun, in the steady presence of Ronan's hand in hers, in the genuine cheers rising from villagers, who had once feared the very curse now broken forever, because one girl had refused to let fear determine the shape of her courage. "From an offering to a queen," Ronan whispered to her, as the ceremony concluded, his voice filled with a joy and peace she had helped him discover across all the months of their journey together. "I do not think either of us could have imagined this ending, when you first arrived at my castle, believing you would simply be discarded. I imagined very little that day, beyond simple survival," Alara admitted, smiling as she leaned into his embrace. "But I have learned, since then, that sometimes the greatest transformations arrive, not through what we imagine for ourselves, but through what we are willing to offer others, freely, and without condition, even when fear would tell us to do otherwise." And so the kingdom of Shadowmere entered a new era, free at last from the shadow of an ancient curse, ruled by a king and queen whose love had proven stronger than generations of suffering, a love born not from grand gestures or political calculation, but from quiet conversations, patient trust, and the simple, steady courage of a girl who had never once let her blindness prevent her from seeing exactly what mattered most. In the months following the wedding, Alara invited Agnes to live within the castle walls, unwilling to remain separated any longer from the woman who had shown her such kindness during the darkest days of her old life in Ashwood. Agnes arrived with tears of disbelief, embracing Alara warmly and marveling at the transformation not only in her circumstances, but in the quiet confidence and warmth that now radiated from the girl she had once worried she would never see again. "I always believed there was something remarkable in you," Agnes told her, as the two women sat together in the castle gardens, the same gardens where Alara had once spent so many uncertain afternoons, wondering whether she would survive her first full moon within these walls. "I only wish I could have known then how far that remarkable spirit would carry you." Nessa, too, remained close to Alara throughout the following years, her loyalty and friendship rewarded with a position of trust and responsibility within the growing household, and the bond between the two women, forged during those early uncertain weeks of Alara's arrival, only deepened as the years passed. Ronan, freed at last from the burden that had shaped so much of his life and his rule, found himself governing with a renewed sense of purpose and compassion, often turning to Alara for counsel on matters affecting the common people of his kingdom, trusting her understanding of hardship and resilience in ways few rulers before him had ever valued in their advisors. Under their joint guidance, Shadowmere flourished in the years that followed, its villages prospering, its people no longer living beneath the shadow of fear that had defined the kingdom for generations. Stories of the blind peasant girl who had tamed a cursed king's inner beast spread far beyond the borders of Shadowmere itself, carried by travelers and merchants to distant kingdoms, becoming, in time, a tale told to children throughout the land, a reminder that courage and gentleness, when offered freely and without condition, could accomplish what force and fear had never once managed to achieve. Alara often reflected, in quiet moments spent walking the familiar paths of the castle gardens she had come to know so intimately, on how differently her life had unfolded from anything she could have imagined during those frightened hours waiting alone in Ashwood, believing herself simply an offering to be discarded by a world that had always seen her as less capable, less valuable, than those who could see the world with their own eyes. She had learned, in the end, that her blindness had never truly been the limitation others assumed it to be. It had taught her instead to listen more carefully, to trust more deeply, to see the truth in people that appearances alone could never reveal. It was that very gift, cultivated through years of quiet hardship and patient resilience, that had ultimately allowed her to reach the man trapped beneath a curse that fear alone had always kept hidden from view. And so, beneath the golden light of countless seasons that followed, the king and queen of Shadowmere ruled together in peace, their bond a testament to the enduring truth that genuine connection, offered honestly and without condition, held power enough to break even the oldest and most stubborn of curses, and that sometimes, the most unlikely person, overlooked and underestimated by nearly everyone around her, could become the very light needed to guide someone lost in darkness back toward themselves.